allihopa. I am going to introduce this in English, obviously, and not in Swedish. I am not awake yet. Welcome, everyone, to this, what is promising to be a highly interesting seminar/workshop on small states and open borders. My name is Maria Strömvik, and I am from the department here at Lund University. And I'm not going to say anything more right now, because I'm going to first invite up two people who would like to say something first of all. And the first person is Jörgen Hettne, who is the director of the Center for European Studies at Lund University. Welcome.
Thank you, Maria. Now, I think you have said all things I should say, so I don't have to say anything. So it's just to say welcome to this very interesting seminar. And the title is Small States and Open Borders in the EU. And as you know, I think also that this is part of a broader project, Navigating the Storm, the challenges of small states in Europe. And that Pia will tell us about very soon. And I'm director for the Center of European Studies here in Lund. And one of the aims we have for our activities is actually to try to bring together researchers from different disciplines. So I'm very proud that we have a seminar which is truly multidisciplinary. So we have different perspectives on this question of borders. I think one question we cannot really avoid is that we have a very visible border between Denmark and Sweden nowadays since 2015. Right, so that is unavoidable to discuss, but we will also hear some other perspectives regarding this. And no, I will not be any longer, actually. I will now give the floor to Pia Hansson, who is director at the Institute of International Affairs, right, at the University of Iceland. Our main partner.
Yes, thank you so much. Good to see you all here. Great to see all this interest in what we, of course, always refer to as small states and anything to do with small states. Within the institute that I had at the University of Iceland, we have a Center for Small State Studies. And I don't know, I'm trying to see if there are any faces here that we recognize from our summer school that we've hosted now for 16 years at the University of Iceland. And there might just be a few of you that have maybe thought about joining that at some point, or have heard of someone that has been there. Just thought I'd mention that. That's our connecting part. This project is an interesting one that we have worked together on with partners that we have been working with for many years. Through the small state summer school that we've had in Iceland, but also other summer schools we've hosted in different partner countries. So I wanted just to tell you a little bit about this and kind of what the focus is and why are we at all interested in these topics. So it is a Jean Monnet Networks project, so it's co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. And that's very important. If anything, the importance of the research funding we can get from the European Union is something that's very, very important to academia, and I think that everyone here should recognize that. It builds on 4 interlinked research clusters that are all focused on the contemporary challenges of small states in Europe. The first one is about the changing security environment in Europe. The second one focuses on the current political turmoil related to immigration. The third one is on small states and open borders, the topic we're going to address here today. And finally, the fourth cluster deals with small states and good governance. So what are the central objectives of the project? Firstly, to examine the coping strategies of small states in the current political turmoil in terms of policy, research, resources and focus. Secondly, to consolidate and expand the current network of universities in Europe focusing on small state studies. We also want to produce advances in knowledge that will facilitate the development of teaching in small state studies in relation to EU studies. And finally, we want to raise awareness and influence policy and practice on the challenges of small states in Europe. To this end, we have already hosted 2 workshops. The first one we held in Vilnius this summer, one in Malta this fall. This is the third one. And we have a fourth coming up, and the final one in Ljubljana in April. At the same time, we've hosted roundtables for young researchers. We also aim to publish and edit an academic book, host an international academic conference in Iceland next fall, hope to see you all there, and conclude with a policy-oriented conference in Brussels in the spring of 2020. So it's ambitious, but we also find that it's necessary, at least that's what we think. In the end, this is what academia should be all about: promoting international cooperation, expanding our knowledge base, and broadening our horizons. I look forward to today's seminar and thank you all, participants and audience alike, for contributing to this timely discussion on open borders, and it is quite good that we're here in Lund discussing this. And before I yield the floor, my deepest thanks to Maria and the team here at Lund. You have done a fabulous job. I tell you that right now, you won the competition, right? So I look forward to our discussions here today, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, Pia. I was thinking about that, how we could exploit the fact that we are organizing a conference on small states and open borders in a geographical area, which I think, unfortunately, we talk too little about in Sweden and in Denmark. And I think it has to do with the fact that this is a border region. And when I went to school, we learned a lot about Swedish history, and then about Nordic history, international history, but we never talked about the border regions. And I suspect that it was, at least before, pretty much the same in Denmark and in other places. And when you start looking at this region, the Öresund region, I think we have a lot to learn, both of us who live here, but also others, from this region, both good and bad. And I wasn't sure how to set the scene for this, for the rest of the day here. But I was thinking when I realized I would have about 8 minutes or so to pinpoint why this border region would be particularly interesting as a study object, that I thought I would just make some very, very random touchdowns in the history of Öresund to just try and provoke a few thoughts or ideas of how actually this region can tell us quite a lot about border areas between small states, and the importance of how the border is actually functioning. That is closed or open borders. And this was, until 3 years ago, as both Pia and Jörgen has already said, of course, one of the most open border areas in the world. And now it is fairly closed again. That's why I couldn't resist, of course, taking a picture like this on the first slide. But I do believe that the Öresund region is kind of a witness to how borders tend to create actually also insecurity, and not only the security that we generally tend to associate them with. And I think one of the touchdowns we could do is from the literature, speaking of borders as battlefields, that of course in this area we have had our fair share of battles. And if you go back to the Icelandic sagas, you can even read a lot of long stories. They are like the modern day police sort of car chasing stories, but with Viking ships chasing each other through Öresund, through the Öresund area. And this was even before we had any fixed national borders in the area. And if you go and count, between 1523 and 1720, there were actually 7 open wars fought between Sweden and Denmark. So as a battlefield, this is an area that has seen what borders can create in that respect. Also, borders are also talked about a lot as sources of income. You have to often pay various forms of taxes if you're going to trade across borders, sometimes even just to get across borders and so on. And in Öresund, we even had something which I couldn't find the English name of. Maybe someone knows. Martin, do you know? The Öresund tull. Sorry? the Öresund tax. It was a tax you had to pay to cross the Öresund between Sweden and Denmark, and it started off as one tax that you paid, but it expanded and expanded to various types of taxes, and at some point it included lighthouse fees, cargo duties, a salt tax, a harbor fee, and a bridge tax, which all of this you had to pay just to get across the Sund in various points in time. And that meant also that big powers, who were much bigger than Sweden and Denmark at the time, such as the Netherlands, tended to have a big interest and a big power interest in the area, and tended to actually try to affect the power balance, partly because they could also then be controlling in part who took in the taxes and how they were spent. Others are talking about the border as a divider of loyalties. It's very popular these days to study identities, to study loyalties of various types. And borders as such are, of course, often seen as a typical divider of loyalties. And in this region, when it, for the last time, I guess, well, we haven't seen the end of history yet, became Swedish, this area, Skåne. Lund University, of course, where we are today, was established by the Swedish government to make sure that this area was now Swedish. And those of you who are interested in history, there's a lot of extremely interesting literature to be read on how this region became forced to have a Swedish loyalty rather than a Danish loyalty, how you were not allowed to speak Swedish, priests had to change the sermons, the language of the sermons, and so on. And the picture that we still use for the logo for Lund University, of course, is signaling this, the loyalty to not only to science but also to the Swedish crown. And finally, you can also, of course, with the most typical, in the most typical sense, think of the border as a control station, and where then the central powers is, of course, controlling who can go back and forth across the border. And I think very few of us realize that the border controls today is not the worst version of controls, because in 1658, the Swedish King Charles X Gustav, or however you would say his name in English, imposed a death penalty for crossing Öresund, even for some years. So this has also been an area which has really seen the problems of that. But at the same time then, and to try and end on a slightly more positive note, there's also been, throughout the history, a lot of people questioning the border, trying to defy it in various ways, and I think one of the more dramatic ones were, of course, the events when Öresund was also the border between Nazi Germany and Sweden during the Second World War, and where in 1943 some very brave Danish citizens formed what they call the Elsinore Sewing Club, which was a secret operation to try and rescue Jews from Denmark across Öresund into Sweden. And they used, among others, this boat. So people have also been questioning, tried to defy borders and tried to work around them. And the last step we thought we had seen here was, of course, then the result both of a long-standing, of course, passport union between Sweden and Denmark and the other Nordic states, but also the result of the 4 freedoms that were born out of the Rome Treaty and the birth of the European integration project in the 1950s. And by the year 2000, when the bridge was opened, it was the physical disappearance of borders in this area. Because for the reason that the bridge came at pretty much the same time, we didn't even see any physical manifestations anywhere of an actual border. We didn't even see the old borders because they had been set up where the boats were crossing. But since we were now going on the bridge, we didn't even see it anymore. And we were just crossing completely freely. We saw no border controls, nothing. It was an area which was still in a I don't know, legal sense, a border between 2 countries, but we did not see it at all. It was not visible. And as such, it was portrayed, especially because of all the universities on both sides of Öresund, by a lot of people in Europe and even in the world, as a very forward thinking and innovative border region, where people showed that you could actually overcome or surpass the problems of borders, and history could move on. We didn't need the strict and physical borders. But then, of course, the reason why I think it's so important that we are here today and discuss this at length is, of course, that since 3 years back, we have a border again. We don't even have any physical infrastructure for it, so it's looking unusually ugly in the sense that it is just sort of a very provisional border set up under or at the Hyllie train station. We had a similar one for what, a year and a half, 2 years at Kastrup, the airport in Copenhagen. And this is the situation we now have, and the situation that I think is worth talking a lot about. Is it the fact that we are witnessing a process of rebordering inside the EU? Are we turning history back? Are we going back to borders? Are we going back to also maybe then the problems and the challenges that were posed by the borders in the first place? What does this mean for the EU's external borders if you start reintroducing borders inside? Does that mean that we lose interest maybe in the EU's common external borders? What does it mean for the security of small states in the EU if we actually are starting to question the whole Schengen and the open border idea that the countries have been working for at least 60 years? And what are the long-term financial, human, and ideational costs of returning to internal borders between the EU member states? And I think this is raising a lot of questions when we actually look at these border control guards those of us who pass Öresund quite often, we see them pretty much every day. And I think that's why I'm so happy that we can organize this conference here today. And that is also why I think that we should keep discussing it and not forget that the border controls, I think, are more important than the actual tiny problem they cause for people who tend to commute across the borders. The problems, I think, might be bigger than that, and I think it's important that we keep discussing it. So with that, I would like to start to hand over to the speakers, the real speakers for today, and our first speaker that I'm very happy to introduce here is Martin Klutz, who is an associate professor and has a PhD in history, I should say, but works now at the Department of Political Science and Public Management at the University of Southern Denmark. And Martin, as far as I understand, in addition to have a general interest in history, you're also having very strong interest in cross-border cooperation and border regions in Europe. So, very welcome.
Thank you. Yes, I am a historian, but I have been going from history into borders, and this today is not much about history, it's more about contemporary issues. It's about borders back in fashion, and are we really fighting at the right front? Which you mentioned that before, Maria, that we had this idea of a borderless Europe, of a borderless world, Öresund region as the cross-border metropolis and so on. And suddenly, out of the blue, more or less, comes this new wave of border controls, militarization, perceived threats, this idea, well, if we just protect our borders, we'll be fine, then we can keep out everything, all the evil of the world. And politicians using that narrative, using these words, and apparently also successfully, because I don't know as much about the Swedish case, but for Denmark, there is a support for the border controls in much of the public, and I think the same applies for Germany, which also has controls on its southern borders and so on. On the other hand, you said this is like a bad border. I mean, it's not a bad border in the Öresund. If you have not seen bad borders for people who come from regions with bad borders, this is still a very, very open border, and the same applies to the Danish-German context. Now, I have taken one historical picture here. This is in 1997 at the border crossing from Denmark to Germany, where at the time when on the one side Denmark was debating to join the Schengen agreement, and the other issue was that the local politicians in the border region wanted to form a Euro region, like something like the Eurozone region, which again, out of the blue, arose these protests, and the whole Danish anti-EU movement tried to join at the border and say, now it's enough. The Grenzen er nået, so there has to be a border. We have to keep our Denmark safe. And this is where I would like to go over to this as well, small states and borders. Why is open borders a challenge, or why do some people say or believe that it's a challenge for especially small states? And why do small states fear this, sorry for the misspelling, fear this foreign influence, intrusion? And in the Denmark-Danish German case, it was very obvious that there was a fear of intrusion, which again, I can't leave history, is of course this narrative of Denmark being a small state, which is bound. It's not the narrative when you take about Danish-Swedish history. This is two big powers who fought on dominating the Baltic Sea region. But the narrative of Denmark as a small state is based on 1864, on the loss of Schleswig, on these aggressive Germans who suddenly came up and fought little Denmark. So they feared this could happen again. So we need this border to keep our small country as it is. If you know the Lord of the Rings, the Shire, the hobbits, and I think Denmark, they like to have this little shire for themselves, where everything is so hyggelig and fine and orderly. On the other hand, especially the small states need open borders, because how can they trade if they don't have open borders? No small state that has closed borders is isolating himself is doing well. We have a lot of new small states coming out all over the world through secession. I don't think a single one of them is doing well. Perhaps Somaliland, which is not recognized yet. There are some good stories from there, but I'm not an expert to tell you about something about Somaliland. But if we look at Europe, small states, and we have some Croatians here. I would argue Croatia is not doing very well. Perhaps Slovenia is doing rather well. Croatia will improve because they are members of the EU. So, and they will have an open border very soon, and Slovenia has an open border to the EU. We can see a tremendous development in the Eurozone region since it had an open border. Malmö has changed so much. We can see actually in Flensburg, the German city on the border where I lived, which is just on the border, which was drawn in 1920, which had a terrible development since then. It was a total stagnation, which has had a tremendous development too since 2001, since the border became open, since the Danes could just cross without showing their passports all the time, without meeting these German border guards with their guns in their holsters and looking, well, who are you, or something like this. Even though they could cross, I mean, there was no visa requirements and so on, but this is a narrative I meet from Danes when we talk about Schengen. And of course, then, what we have today, I have some pictures here where we have seen these here. This is the Copenhagen airport site, and this is on the Danish-German land border. We have some more drastic pictures here. This down here is in Tijuana. It's where the migration, this caravan, or these groups of migrants from Honduras, basically, and have now, I don't know if you know where this is up here. Jana, you might know it. Is she here? This is Narva and Ivangorod in Estonia. So this is an external border. And here, again, we have to keep in mind, this used to be one city. It used to be one city in Russia. It used to be one city in interwar Estonia, actually, because the border was more to the east. And it became an administrative border of the Soviet Union, and now it is an external EU border, and it's heavily militarized, and people have families on both sides. So this is really a bad border. But this is apparently where we are going to. This is what we see in the world. We have seen, I mean, there are figures out there. When the Berlin Wall fell, we thought these kind of borders were history. But it's not. It's the other way around. We have much more militarized borders like the ones here in the world today than we had during the Cold War, and the number is increasing. Some people talk about a new border industrial complex, arguing that, like when in the Cold War, we talked about the military industrial complex, arguing that there are so many companies and businesses that profit from armaments, from the arms race, that they actually pressure and lobby so much that this is a process that can't be stopped by itself. And that this is happening now on the border situation because people make a lot of money. Always, if you are a little bit aware of research funding within the EU, you can also see that technical smart border issues, like how can we control without interfering too much into people's affairs? This is a big thing now. How do we create new borders which are in a way militarized and also controllable digitally? Of course, we have these challenges here, and well, you all know that this was imposed on the 4th of January 2016 as a temporary border control. It has been in force since, with the only difference that the controls on the Copenhagen airport station have been lifted. When I crossed yesterday, the police did, well, I think they shortly looked into the train, but they didn't check me, at least, not on the Danish-Swedish border, but on the German-Danish borders they did. And there was a Swedish guy who only had a driver's license, and he was really, these Danish guys were really like, well, don't you know this? And this is a fee of 1,000 kroners normally, and this is not enough to travel. They were really nasty to this middle-aged Swedish man who never did anything wrong in his life, except for perhaps smuggling a little bit more alcohol than he was allowed. So it's really, you have this, I mean, is this really, why do we do this? Right? And then we say, yeah, it's this refugee, it's terrorists, and so on. So we have this crime. If you ask people on the street in Germany, and probably in Denmark too, they would argue, well, life has become so dangerous. We can't go out in the streets anymore, all these gangs and so on. If you look at statistics, it's just going down, 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 down. Crime is going down all over Europe. And so how is this happening? And we have, of course, this what we call moral panic. These incidents when in New Year 2 years ago in Köln, in Germany, some people of North African descent were having fun, or in their eyes, and attacked, or, well, I mean, it's still very unclear what actually happened and how much happened. I mean, there were no open rapes, but there were attacks on females, which is today used as the image of why the welcoming culture in Germany changed, from being very open towards taking refugees to be more reluctant and to see them as a problem. Some of them had a status that they applied for asylum, of the perpetrators. Most of them did not. Most of them had been, I mean, these were people, young men who were what we called landstryger. It's like these people tramping around, trying to find jobs, living from small petty crimes all over Europe. Many of them had been in Europe for many years. But suddenly it was like, we have to close our borders. This is one. And then, of course, terrorism, international terrorism, as the other threat mentioned, saying we have to close our borders. But why the borders? Because terrorism is not happening at the borders. There's been no major terror attack on any border crossing point, if I remember. Terrorism is a phenomenon of big cities. Crime, gang wars, is a phenomenon of big cities. Why don't we make a border around Nørrebro in Denmark when there is a problem with drug gangs in Nørrebro and ghetto situations? Why don't we I mean, this young man who committed the terror attacks in Copenhagen, he went by bicycle. So why don't we control the bike roads in Copenhagen? It would make more sense. You would probably catch many more people who do something wrong. But this idea that the state demonstrates action if they go to the borders. Borders as a key point of security, keeping everything bad out, is apparently deeply ingrained into an image we have, even though I would argue that no terrorist has been stopped at the borders. Well, actually, there has been one, I think. There was one guy, one Arab refugee. He had a refugee status in Germany, and he wanted to go to Copenhagen and apparently had some ideas about making an attack, and he was actually stopped at border control. Still, I would argue, I mean, the sophisticated terrorist attacks we have had, the more sophisticated ones, they have not been an issue of people transgressing borders, but more about networks and communication, radicalization of migrants who have been living here for a very long time, sometimes even haven't been born in Europe. So what really helps fighting terrorism is cooperation, intelligence. And looking at, the Berlin attack has been analyzed rather deeply now by German media and also the German authorities, and it became very clear that the main issue was that the different police authorities did not exchange information enough to see that here we have a person who is dangerous. The same applies to the Brussels tax. And so we are facing an issue, and this is, the states are looking to cut off, isolate themselves again, while it is actually important that they cooperate more. It's important that they share information. It's important that they trust each other's police forces more, that they know who to call. Like this has been in the Danish media a lot about these COMEX deals, where companies have actually cheated European states by moving dividends from stocks around, and somehow it's a very abstract theme. I never understood how this could work, but apparently it worked, that they could actually get a tax 3-4 times, which they should have only have had refunded once, or perhaps not even have refunded at all, but should have paid. This is a big issue. It went from 2011, 12, 13, something like this, and now Danes have found out that Danish companies were involved in that too, but the Germans never informed the Danish tax authorities on this. Why didn't they call us? Perhaps they didn't know who to call. My experience is when I look on local cross-border issues that often they just don't know who to call. They don't know who's responsible. Denmark, you probably know that Denmark has an opt-out on the police and justice and home affairs, which means that police cooperation is rather difficult, because Denmark is not involved in these European Europol things as the other countries are, because of this opt-out. A solution they have made is that there is an office on the border where Danish and German police meet informally regularly, the joint office. And they do exchange information, which they, if they followed the rules very strictly, wouldn't even be allowed to exchange because of this Danish opt-out. But it shows, again, that if we want to fight terrorism, we have to start a new thinking. I heard a lecture from a former high official of the Department of Justice and of the Department of Homeland Security in the US, who also said that the big factual threats we have, this is cybercrime. It's trafficking on the big scale, human trafficking, and it's the networks. I mean, on the border control, you might carry a courier, a drug courier, or some poor East European who has been talked into smuggling some refugees to supplement his salary of 200 euros a month, which he gets as a truck driver. So it's really the small people. It's not the networks. No big human trafficking network has been destroyed by the border controls, which have been in effect for 2.5, almost 3 years now. It's tax evasion. It's this arms trade, cyber war. So we have to think newly, and it's not about having people standing at the border having a good time, because this is what Danes call a skånejob, like people who have a lot of stress and who cannot do these normal jobs. You can put them on the border because they just stand there and wave, and in the evening they drink beer with their pals, and then every 2 weeks they get 2 weeks off, and then they can go home and work on their houses. But it's important that we do find ways to harmonize data, to get these intelligence people to cooperate, because this is not what they are trained. People who work for SEPO and PET and CIA and so on, they are trained that information is power, so you don't just give it to everybody. Probably we are trained like this too. I mean, as scientists too, we are trained too. If we find out something new, let's keep it for ourselves or for a while, because otherwise people might copy it. And then they get the Nobel Prize and we don't. So it's about this developing trust and cooperating, strengthening the multilateral systems, I would argue. Especially for small states, because small states never have the power to I mean, this idea that if a small state is independent and we have this sovereign world of small states and we're all sovereign, and history shows that it hasn't worked so far. And I think even at the present we can see it doesn't work. We can see that in the Russia-Ukrainian conflict. I mean, they had a treaty in 1994 where Russia guaranteed Ukraine's territorial borders, including Crimea, and Ukraine handed over all their nuclear weapons to Russia in 1994. And then Ukraine used their sovereignty to get closer to the European Union, and suddenly this doesn't work anymore. Danish history is a history of sovereignty until 1863, when Denmark decided they would sign a constitution. This was a sovereign act, I think this is a constitution. We can do this ourselves. This is our land. We can decide it ourselves. A constitution valid in Schleswig. Prussia was offended. There was a war. Denmark lost Schleswig. And from 1864 until at least 1973, Danish foreign policy had to align to Germany. Well, 1945. And this is what they admitted themselves. Denmark was not a sovereign country after 1864, even though today many believe it was. So border control now, and especially small states need open borders. They need multilateral agreements, and they need cooperation. So border is more than police at the borders. It's about cooperation. It's about data exchange. It's about data system harmonization. It's about joint policies to combat crime, because the issues are the same. The issues we face in Europe about migration are basically the same. Also about integration. And I also firmly believe that it's a strengthening of supranational institutions that is helping the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin. Very interesting. I forgot to say before, we are organizing also a panel discussion in the second half of the morning, and we will come back to at that point with questions and discussions, and also we will have a possibility just before, I think, the coffee break to also pose questions. So for now we leave you, but we will come back to you with questions further on. Now, our next speaker, I am wondering if he has turned up. Do we have Joachim here? No, it seems we don't. Well, maybe in that case we can actually see if there are any immediate questions for Martin anyway. And while we wait I know that Joachim is on his way here, but maybe if we have anyone who has any immediate questions, then please feel free to ask. Yes, here's one. I'm going to come with the microphone. Or did you have one?
Thank you very much. My name is Christina Helg. My question would be, what is your take on how can we change the narrative?
Yes, good question. I don't really know. I think it's by repeating it, by taking up the discussions, by being in the media, by trying to get the media covering it, and by going out to schools, actually. But it is a tough discussion. I mean, these debates are. I mean, I think with this situation we have now, where people can get information from everywhere, and where you have people who more and more take in information through peers to their narratives. So over social media, it is a challenge. It is a challenge of, and it is difficult to handle. I mean, and I think this is what we are struggling with too. It's like, how do we report on crime? I mean, there was a policy until some years ago that you do not mention a nationality of a perpetrator if you report on a crime. And this has been, in Germany, it has been changed after Köln. In Denmark, it has been changed, definitely too. And now they do report it, but this, of course, makes that suddenly, if there has been a rape or something, if there has been a killing out of jealousy, like if it's done by a refugee, it becomes national news. Or if it's done like by somebody with a foreign background, if it's not, it remains local news. So we have this, suddenly if anything that has something to do with migration, it becomes national news, even though otherwise it would be a totally local thing. And then trying to mention the perspectives. I mean, the German government just published statistics that every third day, some woman is killed in Germany by her husband, ex-partner. And it's not refugees, it's normal German people. So they have this perspective. I mean, this is not something new. And really trying to rationalize. But it's tough. It's difficult. And of course, then where is the data? Right? So, I mean, Denmark pays, these border controls cost Denmark about 220 million Danish kroners a year. And we have a research grant for border studies for 5 million Danish kroners a year. And we are 6 people working on this. If we had 220 million, we could really do a lot of things. And we would know everything about terrorism in Denmark and security and collect the data. I mean, this data that has been out is that per man, like per policeman standing at the border per year, they have 1.5 cases. So you pay a policeman for 1 year's work standing at the Danish-German border and looking that nobody comes in who shouldn't be in there, and then they pick, they have like 1.5 cases of petty criminals actually. No big fish, anything. Doesn't look very effective, doesn't sound like effective police work or effective use of resources to me. So I think it's pointing out these things, it's really is rationalizing. And getting into the idea that the bad, the evil, or all evil things happen everywhere. It's not something that comes from outside. And it's something that is, well, nobody likes it, so it's a joint interest of everybody in Europe and in principle also of the countries where migrants origin from, if they work, if they function.
Can I just ask a follow-on question to that about changing the narrative? Do you think, and I don't know for all the countries in the EU that have now reintroduced internal border controls, but for Sweden and Denmark, it strikes me that in both these cases, the border controls are imposed far away from the capitals.
Yes.
In Sweden, the border controls are of course imposed by the government in Stockholm, but it's done down here. Denmark doesn't have a border control into Sweden, but it has to Germany, which is also as far away, I guess, you can get from Copenhagen.
Yes.
Does that have anything to do? Is it easier for a government to do it far away than in their own?
I would argue, and especially for the Danish government, you can see they are much against the border controls that Sweden has, but then they introduce their own ones, and they try to convince the Swedish government. They have had ministers down there and on the Danish-German border convince the Swedish government this is enough, that they don't have to control. And I was pretty sure that these pre-checks on Copenhagen airport have been lifted. I mean, the border controls here have been eased a lot. And they have not on the Danish-German. It's the same situation as it was when it started in January. So it's far away, and it's of course, and also like the local mayors of the municipalities on the border have also outspoken themselves against the border controls, and 2 of them are members of the Venstre party. But it is impossible to get through. I mean, the Danish Minister of Integration says that, well, you don't live in real life, we do, which is nonsense, because they live in Copenhagen in their bureaucracy, and we live in real life, those people who cross the border every day. And I mean, here it's only one border, but I mean, Danish-Germany is a land border, and it's a sea border which is easy to cross with small boats. So if you really wanted to control that border, you needed much, much more efforts than now. If there really was a threat, the present control wouldn't hinder. I mean, when I cross it by car, they never check me. They only check 3 crossing points anyway out of the 15. So if you cross it on the west coast, there is nobody there. And they check all the international trains, and there they check everybody, which I think is discriminating train travelers. But it is a very symbolic, and it is draining resources from the police work, which is measurable too in Denmark. It's that they have been slow in treating other cases because of police being moved to the border, and it costs a lot of money. And I mean, these people who work there, of course, have to be loyal, so they don't really say what they mean, I would argue. But there have been people who actually, one of the officers who was like leading some units there has quit because he thinks it's useless to do this job. So it's there, but it's apparently some idea that, well, then the right-wing politicians are happy, right? So they don't make fuss all the time, and we need them for other things. We need them for other political issues in Denmark. Plus, the people are kind of calm, and it's a control that's not interfering that much for the locals. I'm pretty sure we had this question up, is Schengen really falling apart? I would say no, it's not, because there are very strong interests in Europe to have open borders. And I think these controls we have are a good example, because they do not interfere with the people who want to cross, who are locals, and not very much at least. It's of course symbolic and irritating, but and they do not interfere with the movement of goods. And in Denmark-German case, it was very explicit that these logistic companies saying, well, this is Danish export and we need open borders. So we don't want any total control. We don't want a situation like in the US, Canada, where everything is checked.
Do we have other questions? Otherwise, I have more. Anna, we have someone up here. Oh.
Hello, this is Fabio from the department here, PhD student. First of all, thank you for this very interesting presentation. It's, as an Italian, these issues are very, very dear to me in many ways. I was wondering whether, like, we can say something more about how the borders are different, right? You mentioned about the point that there is no security issues when it comes to borders. There is not a single terrorist which was stopped at the borders. And I was wondering if you can tell us more about the data about this, data also about crime. Because if we think about borders like Lampedusa, Malta, Lesbos, every day a Libyan trafficker is stopped. And if we use different definition of what a terrorist is.
Which border?
The Italian border,
yeah.
Malta, Lesbos, and so on. So also the statistic of crime, like depending on the type of crime, we can see that there is a rise in some different crimes. It depends on the different statistics. So this is a critique that is coming from a progressive voice. And how can we actually, as progressive forces, be self-critical of the type of naivety which I've had in the last years, which kind of undermine the way in which we think about security. There is not a security issue, and then the populists win. How can we, as progressive forces, accept that there are issues that need to be taken into consideration without compromising with our ideals of a progressive and open borders Europe?
Well, as I would not call this naivete, though, what happened. Not when we talk about politicians. Perhaps when we talk about people, but it's no. I would not call it naivete. There's of course there are some very radicals who say we should have open borders for everybody. Right? No human is illegal. Everybody should be able to come, which in the way is a very neoliberal way to look at things. Right? Saying that, well, it's just good. I mean, if you talk to it's funny because we have an alliance here between people who would definitely not call themselves neoliberal, but rather leftist anarchists, and neoliberals who argue that, well, this is just good because it creates labor, it creates new initiatives, new better way of life here, better way of life at home, and so on and so on and so on. There is also the fact that with the demographic development we have in almost all European countries, that there is a need for migration. Or, well, let's not say it a need, but there is a capacity for taking in migrants. But then, of course, what about the risks? Who are the terrorists? And terrorism is I mean, and Islamic terrorism, which is the terrorism we look at the moment, it's a global thing, and it's happening mostly outside of Europe, and it is in a way I think it is comparable to the terrorism we had in the 1970s. And I would argue that there is not a direct connection to migration and terrorism. Terrorism it's there. It's mainly there because it's a problem in the Middle Eastern societies, which are patriarchic, which are struggling with modernization, which don't really have an answer to what to do with the high amount of young people they have, which are rather well educated. And on the one side, on the other side, you have these groups. Groups like Boko Haram, where I would argue these are just these old gangs of robbers, which we have had here too in the old times, which now give themselves a somehow ideology, so they can justify that they kill and rape and steal. Which are a symbol of failed states, like states where authority has never been effective, and where states are not able to provide anything for the people living there, and then there is no control, and then such situations, they create these groups. So, and this is a problem that has to be solved there. And when we talk about migration, I mean, the opening of the borders in 2015 was actually much too late, because before it was Italy, Greece, and Malta, and I mean, these countries were left alone by the EU. The countries that, because of the Dublin rules, which actually Germany was a key proponent when they were implemented. Like that, Germany said, well, we have to have these Dublin rules. We have to have, like, the first country where they reach Europe, the first country where a migrant is touching European ground has to handle his case or her case. And this system has not been working since at least the mid-2000s, I would argue, so that because it left some countries alone with the burden. And there has to be some European way to share this burden. And of course, also to define the policy. What is a refugee? I mean, who can be taken? How to organize migration, so that it becomes that there is a possibility to migrate to Europe, but also a message that it can't be everybody. But I think the EU is moving that way. We don't realize it so much because this is something people don't talk about. It's also a little bit nasty. I mean, we have now the EU has made agreements even with the different Libyan governments, apparently, so that they keep the people off the Mediterranean.
Yes, well, thank you so much for this for now, Martin. Is Joachim with us now? Thank you so much for now, Martin. And I know there were more questions, and I'll try to put you first when we come to the question and answer session. But now it is time to hand over to the next speaker, who is Professor Joachim Nagelius.
Thank you.
Professor of EU law at Örebro University.
Well, yes.
And for those of us who have been studying EU in Sweden, we have all in various ways heard your names and your name and seen you. So I think for the Swedes, you are fairly well known. But for the others, I'm just going to say that you are, if not the, so at least one of the few best experts in Sweden on EU law and constitutional law. Yeah. And we are looking forward to hearing your comments on small states and open borders.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. It's always nice to be back in Lund, where I started from, and I was working here until 15 years ago. But I'm sorry I was a bit delayed. I've had a rather hectic scheme, I must say, and I now come from Umeå in the north of Sweden, discussing other related issues, but not the same thing. But anyway, I came in time to hear the end of the previous speaker's presentation or answers to some questions. And obviously you stressed the dangers of some terrorist movements, terrorist groups, and the need, thus, from that point of view, to introduce border controls or other kind of measures for that part. And I don't deny that. I'm not saying that you are wrong, but let me just point out, due to the fact that I'm a little bit delayed and we're running a bit late in the schedule, I was also asked now to talk a little bit shorter. So I will make a brief, let's say, legal argumentation, not against border controls perhaps, but pointing to some of the problems that I think border controls here in the south of Sweden have introduced. And it's in a way logical, because as a lawyer, there's no point in denying that the threats, the dangers that you talked about are real. But at the same time, when you are asked about this kind of legislation that was introduced almost exactly 3 years ago, as a lawyer, and if you're asked by the media, as I was, or if you're asked by representatives of people who were affected by this and wanted financial compensation, as I also was, you tend to focus a little bit on the legal difficulties, because there are legal difficulties with this. And in a way, I'm thankful to you for inviting me, because this gives us an opportunity to discuss also the problems involved in introducing those measures. And I think they were quite severe. I think they were underestimated. I think there are still some problems existing. If we look at the situation here in the south of Sweden, for the commuters in particular, that situation has improved, and you're probably all aware of that. Today, if you travel from Copenhagen to Lund or to Malmö, it's not so painful anymore. You may spend 10 minutes at the Hyllie station, while the police may or may not do a control of your IDs. It's a little bit depending on their mood, it seems, or how much time and resources they have. But you have to stand there and wait anyway. But it's nothing compared to the situation 2 years ago, when you had the double controls. So first you had a control at the Copenhagen airport, starting in January 2016, and then there was a control also at the Hyllie station. And these doubles control led to, according to the statistics that I have, the average journey between Copenhagen and Malmö took 66 minutes, as compared to before the controls were introduced, 35 minutes. This is a good statistics from the Chamber of Commerce, and it's interesting because it doesn't tell you about one single trip when everything went wrong, and you were left in Copenhagen and couldn't come home and so on. These things happen, but they are not the regular thing. The regular thing, of course, are the delays for people who were concerned, and who were so tired and fed up with this, so they didn't really know what to do and where to start. Now, as we know, and I will be very short on that point, this both legally more complicated and practically, for most people, more painful control has come to an end, as we know. It was dropped last year, in 2017, and I would say these are the kind of things that are not always presented as they should be in the media or in the general debate. I would say that it was due to legal pressure put by the EU Commission on the Swedish government, and put by various pressure groups, perhaps, or lawyers groups who influenced the European Commission. Because the legal basis for introducing this kind of control in Copenhagen at the airport, or let's say in the boat between Helsingborg and Helsingør, was very doubtful. It ordered private companies in a way to act as border controllers, and it made the whole situation for commuters here in this area really, really difficult. So, and that was probably not in line with the Schengen rules. It's at least very doubtful. The EU Commission had already in 2014 initiated a survey against the Czech Republic for similar measures in relation to airports and air traffic. And I don't think that could have lasted for a very long time. So when the Swedish government said in 2017, we're going to drop this, we're going to finish with this, it's a combination of a risk analysis, which says that the risk of terrorism or whatever, mass migration, is not so high anymore, and which is stated openly, and the fact that there is legal pressure on the Swedish government, which is not always presented in an open manner. So this we have to take into account, and this is now in a way history, but of course we can discuss it, you can ask questions and so on, what happened. But I think it was a combination of a changed situation in terms of migration and political and legal pressure coming mainly from the EU Commission. So what are we left with then? What do we have today? This is the kind of border controls that still exist and that we meet at Hyllie station or maybe some other place when you enter the country. This we should of course analyze a little bit and see what it means from a legal point of view and how long it can be maintained. We will come to that. But first, of course, if we look back on this and we go back to what happened in 2015, I think this was in a way, a very sad development. Sweden and also Denmark, I would say, are among the countries who have always pushed for open borders between the EU countries and have been good and loyal members of the Schengen area. Denmark with some exceptions and some difficulties 15, 20 years ago, but it's not in the interest of Denmark or Sweden to introduce borders of this kind. And I would also say that of course, since Sweden and Denmark share an interest in promoting the integration here in the Öresund region, none of the countries could actually have been happy with this situation. It is also one of the situations, it's not unique from that point of view, but one of the situations where you find that when something important is happening, something difficult is happening, the countries need to cooperate. They have great practical difficulties in coordinating their work, in this case of the police and the border controls, the customs agencies, and this is surprising. So from a legal, from a formal administrative point of view, the integration process hasn't really come as far as you could wish. From the Swedish point of view, it was contrary to everything that had been said before, Sweden wanting to have a generous refugee policy and so on. The Swedish Prime Minister stating as late as September 2015 that what happened in other countries in Europe when the mass migration movement started in the fall of 2015 went against his vision of Europe and had to be prevented. Sweden shouldn't participate in that when first Hungary and then Austria and then also Germany in a way closed their borders. But it happened anyway, and the background I think we know. I would assume that you have already talked about it, what happened and the reasons for these measures. Of course, a very specific migration situation with as many as 120,000 people coming to Sweden in the fall of 2015. And also a situation eventually where Sweden was one of the few countries in the European Union with open borders. I think we have to remember that also. This was not done because the Swedish government was mean or bad or anything. It was a situation when if Sweden didn't do anything, you could see a scenario where everyone who was migrating to Europe would come to Sweden because it was the last country with open borders. So from that point of view also, I think we can understand that these measures were introduced. I will say that without going into any analysis about the need from a point of view to combat terrorism or anything like that. So these points matter, and I don't see any point today in criticizing the Swedish government from a more, let's say, political point of view. You can also remember that almost all the political parties in Sweden agreed that these measures were necessary at that time, and something had to be done, given that the situation was the way it was, as it was. On the other hand, we can see that the migration movement from the Middle East and North Africa to Europe slowed down rather quickly after these measures were introduced. The fact that many countries in Europe introduced them had something to do with that. In a way, very, very strange agreement between the European Union and Turkey from March 2016 has also affected this. I don't know if you have discussed that before. It's a very strange agreement, and the fact that it is still working is that it's not applied in a way. 1/3 of the agreement is applied, namely the fact that the border between Turkey and Greece is being closed and that Turkey has received money. Other aspects of the agreement, which were absolutely unrealistic, are simply not put into practice. The idea to send back Syrian refugees from Greece to Turkey and then for each person that was sent back to Turkey, send another person to the European Union in a system which I simply couldn't foresee how it was going to work. And it hasn't worked. It hasn't even been implemented. It hasn't even been started. But of course, this agreement between the EU and Turkey also matters. So, together, these things meant that the migration flow, or whatever you call it, slowed down. It's absolutely controllable today, I would say, from the Swedish point of view and from most other EU member states' point of view. The reason why the European Union can't agree today is internal tensions, internal disagreement, rather than the fact that for the moment the migration flow should be a huge threat or danger the way it may have been 3 years ago. I think we should remember those things. And then we come back to perhaps my key issue here, namely, what does this mean for the current Swedish regulation? And how long can that be maintained? And here I have a difficulty. I have not been asked to do or write anything about this in the last year, so I can speak relatively freely about the situation, let's say, after Sweden dropped the double control system, which I thought was legally very doubtful if you analyze it in combination with the Schengen regulations and things like that. Well, since there is no mass migration, no flow of migrants that Sweden can't control at the moment, there has been another reason given for the continuation of those controls, those border controls. And as you probably know, they continue 6 months every time, for every time. And I think, if I remember correctly, the current last decision lasts until February. Correct me if I'm wrong. I didn't have time actually to check that up before coming here. But anyway, sometime in the next year there has to be a new prolongation. And then the Swedish government introduced another reason and invoked that in front of the EU Commission, namely the threat of terrorism, which we have already heard about. And that had some relevance after the attack in Stockholm in April 2017. On the other hand, you can say the perpetrator was an isolated person. It was no signs of any organization behind it, and he was, in fact, a refugee who had come, had not been given right to asylum, was going to be sent back, but while waiting for that and in his desperation, he committed this atrocity. Now, that was a very sad moment, very sad incident, of course, and tragic. But is that reason enough to say that there is a terrorist threat, an imminent terrorist threat against Sweden, which may justify those measures continued 6 months in a row, 6 months in a row? Well, I think that's open to discussion. You may, in that context, you may also actually discuss whether those controls are efficient or not. I sincerely doubt it, because I think they only happen every now and then. I think well-trained, well-equipped terrorist movements, if they want to commit some attack in Sweden, I think they probably already have the resources, and to be a little bit cynical, people here who could be responsible for such an attack being carried out. I'm not sure that, so to speak, the end justifies the means in terms of these controls. And if you look at the Schengen rules, it should only be possible to prolong such actions 6 months in a row for 3 years. That's the maximum time. And that time is running out. So is my time actually now, since I started a little bit late. But I will now, as a start here, simply like to address those issues. I can also, and then we can come back to it in the debate, and you may ask questions. Let me also say that, just to tell you what happened, the group of commuters who wanted financial compensation from the Swedish state filed a complaint to the Swedish Chancellor of Justice, Justitiekanslern, who settles these kinds of disputes normally. The Chancellor wrote a rather positive opinion, but refused to pay out any money. That was totally expected, because it's an authority who is not by nature, not very generous. And then it would seem to be good conditions for an action before the court, which would have been very interesting, because then you would also have had a legal review of the Swedish legislation from 2015-2016, which was undoubtedly very doubtful. But this was a kind of mass action. It would have been a class action, a group action of the kind that some of you may know from the United States, which is quite a new thing in Swedish law. But due to various internal conflicts that I don't really follow in detail, I don't know exactly what happened, the litigants, the claimants, couldn't really agree on how to proceed and the financing of the case and so on. So no legal proceeding was introduced. And I think that's really sad, because many of those people could have had a decent chance of financial compensation from the state, and many of the legal concerns that we may have about this legislation would have been answered. We would have known a little bit more, and that would absolutely have been interesting. Now we stand here with some further questions, and I hopefully I have now addressed a few of them, and we can come back to these issues in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joachim. We have both a little time for questions before the coffee break, and then we will come back to some after the panel discussion. But I think right for now we just jump straight over to our next speaker, who is Neovi Vavula, who is a lecturer in migration and security at Queen Mary University of London. And as far as I understand, if I understood correctly, you have a special interest in European refugee law and migration studies.
Sure.
And,
yes, exactly.
and also sort of legal responses to trafficking in human beings and money laundering.
Yes.
So I think we are all looking forward very much to hearing what you have to say. So welcome.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the organization of this event. Please excuse my voice. I am recovering from a flu that's bothering me the past week, but I wouldn't want to miss this workshop. So I have been asked with this presentation to provide an overview from a legal perspective of the response to what is a perceived refugee crisis and terrorist threats in the European Union. And since this is a workshop also on small states, I thought it appropriate to include some elements of that also in my presentation. So today what I wanted to highlight are basically two issues. First, I wanted to provide an overview of how border control are being reinforced at the EU level, in what I see in my research as a salami approach of the European Union, in a sense that there have been many different responses that change the structure of border control in the European Union in the past few years. So instead of having a more holistic approach towards a reform of the Schengen Borders Code, what we see is that there have been consecutive reforms of it in different small elements, small articles of the code, coupled with other responses that have collateral effect in provisions of the Schengen Borders Code. At the same time, this approach is viewed from the perspective of what is the quest now of the Union, which is to create a security union, which actually shows a conflation between criminal law and immigration law. And with this presentation, I would like to actually harvest this conflation between criminal law and immigration law and see how certain insights from EU criminal law can actually be useful in addressing this reinforcement of border control. Finally, the last point that I want to make is how this new reconstruction of border control in the EU may have an impact in certain small states at the periphery of the EU. I am Greek, but I would not like to focus on that. Today, I will focus on certain perspectives from Malta and Cyprus, which may be useful in our analysis and actually correlate with my argument about how EU criminal law can actually be useful here. So, border control in a security union has been reconstructed in a multiple ways. I will not focus on externalizing border control. However, this is also part of the discussion. The previous presentation highlighted the EU-Turkey deal. This is a key component of what is now an externalizing migration control policy of the EU. But at the same time, at the border, borders control have been changed in multiple ways. A key example has been something that has not been highlighted much by legal scholarship, has been the systematic border control that is being taking place at the external borders of the EU that relates to EU nationals. And this is something that has been taking place since 2 years now. It followed the proposal of the Commission that was really speedily adopted and basically involved the systematization of border control of EU nationals when they enter and exit the external border of the EU. So it doesn't include EU internal borders, but it involved EU nationals entering and exiting the Schengen area. And this involved a change in Article 8 of the Schengen Borders Code, which basically provided national authorities with a possibility, basically with a requirement to check against all necessary databases the passport details or the identity details of all EU nationals. So this was the first response, and one first response that actually had a significant impact in how EU nationals were being perceived by the EU as potential threats, in the sense that instead of having only checks on spot, the checks were pretty much systematized and were taking place on every time an EU national would cross the external border. And I will not just focus at this point at what were the implications on that potentially to EU nationals and, of course, to the traffics at the external border. I will focus on that afterwards. At the same time, EU nationals and third country nationals are subject to and will be subject to further controls at the external border. This has been done through using new technological means, as opposed to the past, where only certain categories of third country nationals would be targeted by information systems. 2 new information systems were actually negotiated in the past 2 years, quite speedily again, in order to monitor the entry and exit of third country nationals in the European Union. And these systems are what is called the entry and exit system. The entry and exit system, the EES, basically operates, means that the Schengen area will operate in the future in the form of a Schengen hotel, whereby a third country national, when they enter the Schengen area, they will have to check in and provide their details, including some of their biometrics, and when they would get out of the Schengen area, when they will leave, they will also have to check out, as we do in a hotel. And this will apply not only to visa holders, visa applicants, but also to non-visa holders. The same also will, a similar system is also the ETIAS, the European Travel Information and Theorization System, a system that was adopted earlier this year, and basically it will mimic the US ESTA system, whereby again non-visa applicants will have to obtain a prior authorization. They will have to be pre-vetted by national authorities before they enter the Schengen area. Again, both of these measures will have collateral effects in the Schengen Borders Code, in the sense that borders control are not going to perform in the same way as they used to because of these new technological means. Another issue that has already been highlighted upon by previous presentations, of course, and it's one of the elephants in the room, is the temporary reintroduction of border control. And as you already know, according to the Schengen Borders Code, there are 2 different ways in which border control may be reintroduced. These are on the basis of Articles 25 to 28 and Articles 29. The first one involves the temporary reintroduction on the basis of threats to internal security or public policy, and the second, Article 29, involves persistent threats in carrying out borders control. And something that I'm not sure whether it was mentioned, the Commission, in order basically to formalize and legalize what member states have already been doing at the national level in the past few years, has proposed new legislation in order to modify these articles with the effect of basically expanding the initial 6-month period of reintroduction of border control to 1 year. That can be then expanded by 6 months and then renewed for 3 times. So the rules on temporary introduction of border control are also to be changed. And to the best of my knowledge, I checked that last night. The Council has reached its own approach, its general approach. It is in the process of negotiating with the Parliament, but the Council doesn't have any documentation as to how these negotiations are progressing. I know that the Parliament has also reached their views, but I'm not aware of how the negotiations are progressing because of lack of documentation. Finally, there are other ways in which the border control are being changed. How these involve, of course, how Frontex mandate is going to be changed and how border surveillance operating at the national level will be changing on the basis of formalizing Eurosur rules. I'm not going to focus on that. This is something that's completely separate from border control, not exactly completely separate, but if we focus on all that, this will be already too much. And at the same time, one cannot but forget that these rules are basically coupled with a change in also the operation of visa rules, with a punitive approach towards third countries that do not comply with return processes at the EU level, and this is in strike contrast with lack of any true solutions towards legal access of persons in need. So what I wanted to highlight with that is that the response in borders control has been towards more of maximizing any preventive measures preventive measures and control on mobility, not only migration, but mobility in general. And I'm using the word mobility on purpose because another mechanism that is going to be used is, and basically it's already being operated in many states, involves the harvest of PNR travelers' data, basically data of air travelers who are being taken by law enforcement authorities prior to traveling, so as to identify unknown threats. So we see this shift from migration and border control to controlling mobility more generally through prevention. This has been taking place in different ways through maximizing cooperation and through also agentification. This is evident by the expanded mandate of Frontex. At the same time, the fact that border control are to be reintroduced means that the prerogatives of member states are being taken more into account, more sovereignty is being granted to member states in how they want to operate their border control. But at the same time, the fact that many of these measures also affect EU nationals equally with third country nationals, so that there is a progressive downgrading of human rights and free movement rights of EU nationals. So we see that whilst in the past there is a change in the paradigm, whereby whilst in the past there was more emphasis on how to implement measures that would try targeting more and more third country nationals, this is basically changed in a paradigm whereby EU nationals are also being viewed equally as threats to the security of the European Union. And this is evident by the fact that systematic controls are being taking place towards EU nationals, the fact that PNR data involves travelers' data which do not differentiate between EU nationals and third country nationals. The new information systems, the EES, European Entry-Exit System, is being discussed as to whether it can be expanded also to EU nationals. And of course, the temporary introduction of border control primarily affects EU nationals as well. So we see this progressive downgrading of EU citizens' rights. This, of course, has significant repercussions as regards their free movement rights. As a Greek national, and my passport does not have the same value. I feel that my passport does not have the same value as other EU nationals. Progressively, as I travel around Europe, I find myself being targeted because I am Greek more than other nationals, in the sense instance, that I see that my passport is being checked twice and 3 times in order to make sure that it is not counterfeited and fraudulent. This, unfortunately, may lead to discriminatory effects, and I have felt a chilling effect that when I cross, in cases of especially reintroduced border control, I feel that my passport is really of no value, and I have to explain myself why I am traveling. At the same time, we see that these measures also show that there is a fragmentary Schengen area whereby we see adjoining circles of border control taking place one after the other, and people are not being left without being controlled at least once. And this involves, again, more and more EU nationals than in the past. Another effect has to do with permanence. I think that this is something that is highlighted already, that even though these threats and the term crisis seems that demonstrate some kind of that these are temporary. It's temporary problems that the EU is facing. The quest of security union and the fact that all these measures are being changed very quickly, very much adopted without being reconsidered in the future. It's more about how to, what more we can do, rather than whether we can evaluate ex post whether these have actually helped. So a permanence of these effects and basically the narrative of crisis thus collapse. At the same time, other rights are being affected. The rights to private life, the rights to data protection are being also key in that respect. But mostly what I wanted to, when I see these measures, I see a lot of distrust and suspicion. And this distrust is being oriented towards other member states, of course, towards third country nationals, towards EU nationals. There is an element of distrust that has been clouding the EU. And this distrust means that a probabilistic logic has been formalized. Probabilistic logic means that a series of risk assessments need to be taking place on multiple occasions. For instance, in the case of temporary reintroduction of border control, member states need to provide a risk assessment as to why this is necessary. If member states wish to drop a systematic controls towards EU nationals, they have to provide a risk assessment whether this is actually justified. PNR as a mechanism operates on the basis of probabilistic logic because on the basis of travelers' data, authorities seek to identify unknown individuals. Therefore, it is based on this logic. This probabilistic logic is formalized within the EU, and I find that this is problematic because it can lead to adverse effects towards individuals, and people can be wrongly accused, they can be wrongly implicated, they can be wrongly delayed in their traveling. At the same time, these reforms, which have, as I said, easily been adopted, have not been accompanied by measures that are of support to third country nationals. And the example of the humanitarian visas, I think it's telling towards that respect. We see all these mechanisms that are being more about cooperation, it's more about repression, prevention of entering, controlling of movement, but we don't see that these measures are coupled by responses that provide legal access to those, especially to those in need. So these all mechanisms are basically blurring the boundaries between criminal law and border control. And in the first presentation, it was mentioned that border control is not just about police, it's about cooperation. And but at the same time, border control has been very much linked with law enforcement. And a telling example in that respect is Opinion 115. Opinion 115 is a judgment by the Court of Justice, which basically ruled that the EU-Canada PNR agreement was unlawful, was disproportionate in the light of the right to private life and the right to data protection. And in there, the PNR that I mentioned before, PNR as a scheme was viewed to operate towards law enforcement and border control. These were put together. So looking into border control from a criminal perspective, yes, looking into border control from a criminal perspective, I see that this lack of mutual trust between member states in particular, what are the solutions? What can we do to enhance mutual trust? And mutual trust is a term that has been used under EU criminal law in order to enhance cooperation between member states. And there, we see that the way of fostering mutual trust between member states was to introduce mechanisms which protect human rights of individuals. And there were like a few directives that were adopted. These directives on mutual trust basically were involved defense rights. And I think that if we want to enhance mutual trust among member states, a perspective that will foster fundamental rights protection and enhance fundamental rights protection in the EU could be a solution. And what I mean by that, there are a series of ways in doing so. For instance, the issue of humanitarian visas, more stricter rules and clearer rules protecting individuals from detention as asylum seekers or as irregular migrants, better reception conditions, in the standards in receptions, safer entry and access to protection, and of course fairer distribution of individuals. So by enhancing human rights protection through mechanisms catered for that within the EU, mutual trust can be enhanced, and these other repressive measures may not be as useful. Finally, I only have one more slide that involves small states. The extent to which these mechanisms can be really problematic or being useful for small states like Malta and Cyprus, which are at the periphery of the EU, I don't see that much of a problem. This is, of course, preliminary research, and if you have any comments on that, I'd be happy to hear them. Of course, Cyprus and Malta are small island states. They have their structural vulnerability, which is inherent in their island status. At the same time, the fact that they are islands are a curse and a blessing at the same time. People may be stuck at an island, but at the same time, they don't share the same problems that other smaller states in the EU with land borders have. However, we see that in both cases, there have been persistent human rights violations. This may involve detention. This may involve reception facilities. In the case of Malta, there have been a lot of accusations about non-refoulement. Malta has also have a very problematic relation with Italy as regards the search and rescue operation. Therefore, my only comment, and with that I won't finish, if a more fundamental rights approach would be preferred, and if human rights standards are being enhanced in instruments within the EU, that will have a significant effect also to small states, which do not have the same power in negotiating. Especially we see that with Malta and Italy, we see a problem there in negotiating their position as regards the search and rescue operation. So the enhancing mutual trust through enhancing human rights provisions in the EU could only have a benefit to smaller states at the periphery of the EU. I don't see any other problem with that. And with that, I think I'm done with my presentation. Thank you so much. And again, I'm very sorry for my voice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Niovi, and we will come back with questions at a later stage. And move over now to the next speaker, who is Dana Lusa, who is an associate professor at the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Zagreb. And am I right to say that you're also the Vice Dean for Science and International Cooperation?
till 1 month ago. So,
okay,
yeah.
so that's an older title.
Yeah, I was.
But in any case, you are very welcome, and we're
Thank
looking
you so
forward
much.
to hearing your intervention.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to say thanks to Pia and Thomas as project coordinators, and also to Maria, Jana, and all the colleagues for making us very welcome here in London, for organizing such a great workshop. I'm aware of the fact that I am one of the last borders which is dividing you from the coffee break. So this is quite challenging to be in this position, and especially after such a great presentation. So I will try to be very short. My lecture today, or my presentation, is actually showing 3 perspectives: the European, the Western Balkans, and the Croatian one. Okay, I will start with some of the pictures at the beginning of the migration crisis in Europe, which you were all faced with, when Europe showed solidarity, cooperation, humanity, so on and so forth. Afterwards, when migrants started to come at our borders, actually narratives and political discourse completely changed. So we have demonstration, we have countries putting up wired fence, we had closing of the borders. We have really different narratives and stereotypes which were developed among EU member states, especially those coming from Central and Eastern Europe, and those which were faced with the migrants knocking at the borders in such a huge number. So here are some of the pictures you're most aware of. Okay, in terms of numbers, these are numbers you are familiar with, just to make sure to see how Western Balkan was involved in the entire migration crisis. Here you can see the migration route, as well as the countries which received most of the migrants at the beginning of the crisis. So you see Hungary, Italy, Germany, and so on, while you see the Western Balkan regions, which at the beginning was not affected by the crisis, but after Bulgaria closed its borders and after Hungary closed its borders, then the Western Balkans actually became a hotspot of migration crisis. So you can see here that Western Balkans from January to July 2015 was just witnessing 100,000 migrants coming through our countries. But as the migration crisis developed, the figures went to 800,000, and there we were faced with problems, because actually Croatia was a EU member state, the recent member state, who was supposed to protect EU borders. Slovenia was the member states, as well as Hungary, who was supposed to protect Schengen borders. And we had the other Western Balkan states who were faced with such a huge numbers of migrants coming to Europe, and they are not even the EU member states. So the question was raised why the burden is actually on the European countries who are not the EU member states, and how can they respond to these numbers. One other phenomenon for the Western Balkans is, as you can see, that no one wanted to stay in our countries. So all the migrants just went through, and very little number of them applied for asylum in Croatia or in other Western Balkan countries. And this is also the phenomenon which we have to take into account when we are considering the response of Western Balkans countries towards migration crisis, and the narratives and public discourse which was developed because of the migration pressures. Here you can see some numbers for Croatia. So we had like 0.14 of EU total asylum applications, which shows you the percentage of people which actually ask for asylum in Croatia. Here are some concrete numbers. After the numbers, I will just, I'm coming up to European perspective. I was very much privileged to hear a very great lecture of Professor Michael Ignatieff from Central European University, who actually questioned whether this migration crisis is really unprecedented crisis. Because if you if you go back to history, we are very much aware of the fact that Europe was faced with migration crisis in the past also. But what is very particular and unique about this crisis, that there are a lack of some concrete solutions. One of the solutions which was used back then was the enhancement passport. So this is the example how refugee policy always is forged by crisis, but how can you actually react to the crisis which is developing in front of your eyes. So we have this at the European level. We had the struggle between the universal solutions and the conflict between those universal solutions, universal rights, and the state sovereignty. So actually, we had mechanisms to confront this crisis, but small states, especially in the Western Balkans, felt like they were on their own in terms of dealing with the numbers of people who were coming to Europe. And then finally, a leviathan of state sovereignty was enforced. So they were just saying, okay, we are trying to protect our borders because we don't have some universal or unique solution to deal with such huge numbers of refugees. So Europe actually worked very hard from 45 to 51 and after 89 to build some universal mechanism, to build universal open society in Europe, to create open borders. But when the migration crisis started, it's actually also the crisis of these universal solutions and universal rights started to occur. So Hungary was the first country or the frontline state who was supposed to deal with the migrants coming to Europe. It decided to roll out the wire and to take no refugees. Okay, so this is the show of solidarity, where we have the show of sovereignty, where we have this conflict between sovereignty and the universal rights we were promoting at the European level. There are some measures which are taken, like triage and making, of course, the division between migrants and refugees, and in terms of dealing with the numbers of people coming to the European continent. If we look at the causes of the crisis, of course, we can go back to the history, but we don't have so much time. So we can say that the crisis is definitely, some of the causes is Western countries' failure of 10 to 15 years ago. Then we failed to assist the frontline states. At the end, also there was the cutback in refugee food aid, and at the end of 2014. And these were all the causes of the crisis which developed further now. To finish this European story, so we had a Schengen system being damaged by the refugee crisis. We had Dublin stopped working. We have also, of course, the Brexit, which was partially also affected by the migration crisis. We built the Fortress Europe, although we call it Open Border Europe, but actually it is a Fortress Europe if you look from outside the Schengen area. So actually, whether we built walls or not, it's a question we can discuss during the question session. And also, Again, we have a division, let's say, between old and new Europe, where we have Central and Eastern European states and Western Balkan states which reacted in one manner, and we had the Western European states who actually received the most asylum application, which we had to deal with migrants to integrate them to the society. But also with the measures which were taken at the borders, and also in terms of different policies in Central and Eastern Europe, we can definitely say that we now witness the emergence of the new Europe in terms of this crisis. Now coming to concrete measures to the Western Balkans, when crisis started, Bulgaria built a fence along the land border with Turkey, and then all the migrants went through Macedonia and Serbia through the borders with Hungary. When Hungary closed its borders, then Serbia transferred all the migrants to Croatian border, and then Croatia did the same and transferred all migrants to Slovenian border. The very big problem in the entire migrant crisis which Western Balkans countries were faced with is the lack of coordination, of course. Then we had different policies in different states faced with the crisis. Then we actually did not feel any responsibility for the cause or the ability to solve the crisis. So Western Balkan states were acting like that because the migrants were just traveling through our country. They were not staying there. So actually our citizens were not faced in a daily life with huge numbers of migrants wandering the streets or asking for asylum. So we were actually in a completely different situation than their destination states, EU member states. So all the governments in the region took measure of increasing border control, monitoring green borders, taking part in meetings at the European level, and tried to find some kind of solution to the crisis they were overwhelmed with. So we first show detachment from the crisis, and there most of the Western Balkans countries show frustration and panic because they didn't know how to deal with such huge numbers of people. Very much we were saying that there is the lack of European solution. We accused each other who is closing the border, who is transferring migrants from one state to another. Then we pled for solidarity. We can also see, if we take a look at the public opinion polls, that anti-immigrant rhetoric was developed also in a public discourse. They were barred we were recalling tragedies from the wars in the 90s, and also at the beginning of crisis, Angela Merkel clearly said this crisis could start another fight in the area of Western Balkans, because you have so many different cases of states dealing with the crisis Western Balkans was faced with. The second part, I'm coming to the second part of presentation. These are different solutions which have been conducted by different Western Balkan states. Macedonia was faced with a political crisis at a time when migrants start coming in. They were very much critical of the EU and its policies. They accepted additional police force. They sent armed troops to the border. This was their response to the crisis. Serbia, on the other hand, actually started to organize transfer for refugees from Macedonian border to from their border to Croatia, or before that to Hungary, and they were very much keen to show themselves as a EU candidate state, and actually they were given a green light for opening chapter 23 and 24, and they were recognized for the efforts which were they did during the crisis. Croatia was very much in promoting a humanitarian approach. We were also faced with parliamentary election. We actually wanted for other states to share the burden, and this was the policy of most of the Western Balkan states. Please share the burden with us, and the methods which were actually conducted and used to share the burdens were not the most effective ones. So Croatia organized transport, and most citizens just saw refugees on screens. They were not faced with them in a daily life. Slovenia, which was the Schengen state, was also very much overwhelmed by the crisis and was searching for a common solution in the region of Western Balkans. And after Hungary closed its border, then Slovenia was faced with a huge amount of refugees, and we had all the conflicts which were present in the Western Balkans in past, they were awakened by the crisis, because Croatia had then a dispute with Slovenia on sending so many migrants to Slovenia border. Then Croatia had a dispute with Serbia because of returning some refugees to Serbian border or stopping them at the Serbian border. Then Macedonia had different issues with Greece. So you can see how migration crisis affected the Western Balkan states. So they were, to conclude the second part, there was an extraordinary pressures of the government in the region. more assistance from the EU was expecting, and being EU member state did not influence countries' responses. So we had similar responses coming from Croatia and Serbia with the transfer of migrants and applying this humanitarian approach, while Slovenia, which is a EU member state, and Macedonia were very much keen in protecting their borders, putting barbed wires or sending their military to the borders. And now Croatia's concrete response to the crisis. In 2015, we implemented the Act of International and Temporary Protection. Then we also adopted a decision on a relocation, resettlement of third country national and stateless person in need of international protection. We pledged to accept 530 persons to share the burden of crisis. We established intergovernmental working group. We also established different temporary reception centers. And after the first migrants knocking at the borders, when we consolidated, actually it worked quite fine. Then we also organized different lessons for persons under international protection of Croatian language. And as you can see, there was a major increase in number of file applications for international protection in Croatia, but however, very few of migrants decided to apply for asylum in our country. We also contributed to the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa, and there were all different responses from our side. And now coming to the last part of my presentation, these two levels were just served to show the European response, the Western Balkan response, and now how Croatia actually dealt with the crisis. I already mentioned the phenomenon that no one wanted to stay in Western Balkans. And what is very much indicative is the case of our public being very much against migrants coming in Croatian. There were different stereotypes which were developed among Croatian population, and they were also very much against receiving any more migrants and integrating them in Croatian society. My colleague will, during the roundtable, speak about Islamophobia being developed in Croatia. And here I will just show some preliminary results of my research, which was conducted at the level of the University of Zagreb, how student population actually reacted to migrants coming through Croatia. And as you all know, Europe was faced with economic challenges, cultural identity challenges, security challenges. There are some statesmen from leading EU statesmen which actually show you the narrative and the public discourse, which was much present at the European level. So basically, there are three types of stereotypes which were developed at the European level, but as well in Croatia. First is economic stereotypes, where our population actually sees migrants as threat to workplaces, the social system, as a competition for low-paid workers. While if you see numbers, you can see that the EU 27 will lose 33 million working age persons and so on and so forth. So if you see also the projection of the to employed population age below 45 by member states, in the no migration scenario, you can see the numbers are showing a completely different picture, or the correlation between immigration and unemployment and the European level. There were also security stereotypes. The first one is actual national security in terms of managing challenges that can undermine state sovereignty, and that is what most of small Western Balkan states were applying to. And then the human security, which is related with migrants coming through our countries. And the last stereotype was cultural identity, where actually most of the countries which were faced with migration were afraid that migrants do not share their culture and national identity, that they will change the way of living, their culture and religious beliefs. So if we see this at the level of the European Union in spring 2016, public opinion in the European Union was seeing immigration as #1 issue at the European Union level. In Croatia, it was also the second most important thing which our society was faced with. Coming to some last slides, I will just show you some of the results of the research we conducted. So we analyzed the public discourse in Croatia by the opposition and government. We also analyzed whether there were some stereotypes present in public discourse which were affected by migrants crossing the borders and with migration wave coming to the European Union. Then we analyzed what are students, whether they develop some kind of stereotypes, whether economic security or cultural identity, how this was actually connected. And I will just come to some concrete results so that you can see and to the conclusion. So here you can see some of the results from 2016 and 2017. So more than 50% of students actually agree that migrants present a threat to European culture and identity. Most of them felt unsafe, although migrants just crossed the border to Slovenia. They did not remain in Croatia. Then you have Republic of Croatia should strengthen security measures, 78% share that opinion. Other EU member states should strengthen security measures, more than 80% share that opinion. Number of risk of terrorist attacks have increased 79%, crime rate 51%, rapes and robberies 51% also. And what is very indicative, the government and the opposition really did not share this kind of discourse. They were more neutral and positive toward migrants, except from opposition actually implying that we could protect our borders and send some forces. And the last slide, with which I will conclude my presentation. So the refugee crisis was an extraordinary experience for Europe and for the countries in the Balkans. We were faced with the rise of populism, different stereotypes towards migrants. The Fortress Europe actually came into the question, as well as all universal rules. All the Balkan countries were just a transit route to the other EU member states. They actually believed their contribution could only be temporal and limited, and that the Western Balkan states do not need to share the burden of the crisis. The membership in the EU was not deciding factor in forming the policies toward the crisis. We also had the strength of Leviathan, or the return to sovereignty, in terms that the main responsibility lies with countries, and small states of Western Balkans are quite fragile to deal with such huge numbers of refugees. And of course, the crisis of universalism at the European level actually implied that every single state needs to find its own solution, and this especially is a case of Western Balkan states. So was I in a minute time? Almost. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dana. And we had planned now to have a question and answering session, but since we are running late, I suggest we go straight to the coffee. And I suggest that those of you who are sitting here with a lot of interesting questions for the speakers, you can either approach them during the coffee or think about how to pose your questions and come back with the questions in the discussions that we are having after the coffee break, where we will have a panel discussion with the previous speakers plus 2 more interesting scholars who will join us. But that means that we take a break now, and we are all back here at 20 minutes past 11. Thank you for now. Okay, I will speak. Oh, maybe now. Oh, now it's working. Now, when we are all refreshed from some coffee and lussekatter, I forgot to say that to the foreigners here. This was a very traditional Swedish before Christmas bun, including saffron. That we had with the coffee. But so now everyone are refreshed, and it's time to have a discussion again. And 4 of the people on the panel I have already introduced before, so I'm not introducing you again. But we have also 2 new people in the panel. We have Marcus Idvall, who is the director at the Lund University's Center for Öresund Region Studies, I think is the English name.
Yes.
Is that correct? And also you are based at the Department of Arts and Cultural Sciences. And as a special interest in, as far as I understand, transnationalism and national identity, but also regional movements. Am
That's
I
right,
fairly correct in saying that? Wonderful. So welcome. And then we also have, I'm very happy to say, from the other side of Öresund, we have Katarina Sørensen, who is the head of research at what I think is called in English the think tank Europa, which is in Danish, I think, Tænketanken Europa. And Katarina holds a PhD from Copenhagen University, but is now then working at Think Tank Europe, and has recently published a report on the future prospects of the Schengen area in light of the prolonged border controls in Denmark. So welcome to you too, and then I'm going to hand over also the moderator role here to my colleague Rickard Bengtsson, who is an associate professor at the department here at Lund University, the political science department, and has a special interest in global political economy and regional cooperation and security, and a lot of it tied to the European Union, I should of course say, but also who has been a senior advisor in the Swedish Prime Minister's office and also in the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, conducting long-term strategic security policy analysis. So he knows also from a practical perspective a lot about small state security. So Rickard, with that I am handing over this session to...
Thank you very much, Maria, for this opportunity, and thank you to all the panelists. Let me say that initially so that I don't forget it afterwards. I think we have an intense hour ahead of us, and I'll start this session by leaving the word to the 2 newcomers here. They have been in the audience all morning, but haven't spoken individually yet. So Katarina and Marcus will get a chance to reflect for a couple of minutes each on things that the other panelists have said already. Then I have 2 major themes that I thought we would briefly address to get the discussion started. But quite soon, I'll invite all of you to ask questions and address comments and so on to the panel here. But Katarina, would you like to say something initially?
Great. So thank you for inviting me to this panel. As mentioned, I've done some research mainly on the Danish-German border controls, and I could very much echo what we already heard this morning from my Danish from my colleague from Denmark. So I just want to add a few reflections from this morning, and maybe also there was a comment also on what statistics are being used, and to maybe go into some of the numbers on the Danish situation. So first of all, it strikes me that there are so big differences between the Danish and the Swedish instances of border control. I think you mentioned, it's not so bad, and trying to a bit on the apologetic note, and we have border controls, we need that because of it. In Denmark, the situation is quite different. We have the Danish People's Party who says, here's border cake, be proud when you see the Danish border guards, this is, they have to be bold, and it's part of our sovereign nation, and the rhetoric is completely different, and it's something that Denmark really wants to flag as a nation, that here are our borders, and talk about building physical barriers and so on. So I think that discourse is quite different from the Swedish one, where it's a bit more, it's hidden or not so. It's very visible. The numbers are much higher. An estimate is that about 70 to 80% of border crossings between Denmark and Sweden, I checked, and the Danish figure in to the German side is about 5%. So it's actually very, very low numbers in the Danish case, but much more visibly and proudly done. 60% of the Danish population think that the border controls are in some ways effective, according to a poll that we did at Europa. And in the Danish debate, figures are often given to justify that these border controls are effective. The figures that are given are figures for those who are refuted at the border, so not allowed entry, and those who are charged with a criminal offense at the border. The figures for the ones who are refuted have been, during the 2.5 years Denmark has had controls until this summer, it was 6,500 people who were refuted at the border. And 5,000 people who were charged in the same period with a criminal offense. And in the debate, that's been raised as being big successes of the border controls. But nobody has compared it with the situation before the controls were instated. And we did some research on that part of it to find as comparable figures as possible. And it actually seems that the number of charges for the 2 police districts that are affecting the controls have dropped since the situation before the border controls. And if you look at those refuted, they include EU nationals, Danish nationals whose passport has expired, and there's no figure of how many could actually re-enter after having gone and picked up their passport or crossed when there was no control. And if you look at figures for how many people were sent out of Denmark before the controls, that figure was also higher than the average figure for those who were refuted at the border before. So there is very little evidence to suggest that this border control is effective, despite 60% of the population believing so. As was also mentioned, it costs a lot of money. Our figures is about 2 million euros a month. The consequences are also in terms of the man hours the police use. That has resulted in, over the same period, that the time between someone reports an offense and that is leading to a charge has increased by 91% for the police to respond to the issues. So it seems that there are very clear consequences in other parts of Danish society. Those are national consequences. The other consequences, I think we might discuss a bit later, are the consequences for the future of Schengen as a principle in Europe. The domino effect it can cause on other EU policies, such as the Dublin regulation, and ideas of mini Schengen, so other centrifugal effects. And the final thing I wanted to raise then in this very short introduction is that we actually have another small state that was not brought up this morning that does not have border control but still has border control, and that's the Netherlands. Even at the height of the migration crisis, the Netherlands did not introduce formal border controls, but instead they relied on their usual practice of having a 20-kilometer zone around their borders where their police can effect spot checks. And they actually do that for an average of 6 hours a day, and that's completely within the Schengen rules, but it's not the physical border controls. And what I find striking in the debate is in Denmark and also in Sweden is why not just do that? I mean, what is the big difference? And you're still within the Schengen rules, and you can keep going without having this public and very visible display, very symbolic display. I think that's where I will leave you for this introduction.
Thank you so far, Katarina. Marcus?
Okay. Yes, I'm a cultural scientist, so I have maybe a bit of a different perspective on these border issues. But I must say that it was really nice and inspiring to listen to all the presentations here this morning and to get a different perspective on this, or from a political science and social science. But I'm a director of this Center for Terrorism region studies, and we are of course interested in in the interaction across the Öresund from different aspects. We're interested in, for example, commuters and commuter situations, and we're also interested in this refugee situation that was this migration crisis that was 3 years ago. And actually, I want to mention that we at that time we were part in a documentation project together with museums and archives here in southern Sweden. So we actually documented this crisis at the railway stations, and both in Copenhagen and in Malmö, and we looked at how people also reacted to this situation, how volunteers acted in this situation. So we have been pretty much on the border this morning, and we have looked at this border as some kind of straight or line on the map in a way. But from my perspective, more cultural perspective, I look at the border also as a kind of borderscape or a landscape, a contact zone where this border is negotiated, you can say. So we are interested in what's going in a way what happens in a society which decides on closing the border, closing it in relative terms. Then of course closing it for some people, but not closing it for everyone, of course. That is questions that we are interested in. What happens in a society, not just on the border, but also inside of the border and outside of the border. So these were central questions that we dealt with in this project in 2015 when we followed volunteers' work with refugees. And this has been documented, and if you're interested in the regional museums here and archives have a lot of material, both written material and a lot of photos also, of course, from this. And one thing that hasn't been that much mentioned this morning, but which I'm of course interested in, because I'm interested in what's going on in the separate individual societies, is of course the question about nationalism and how that has increased in the last few years, and in a way polarize debate in many countries, not just here in Sweden but also elsewhere. So I'm interested in not maybe border control in itself, but more border work and how this border work or this border practice is how the border is performed in separate societies. For example, today in Sweden, where we have both people who work a lot for receiving refugees, but also this anti-immigration movement, you can say. So it's you want to look at this clash between different practices, between different values, and also, of course, in a way, different political ideologies. I wouldn't. Maybe I shouldn't say anything about that here at this department. But of course, this is both political and cultural in many ways. I think I stop there.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now I suggest then that we, in a sense, leave or at least enlarge the Öresund region to something more general. I have two items on my list here that that I would like to hear the panel comment upon. One is, in a sense, more conceptual, having to do with the relationship between security, states, and borders, with a view to small state perspectives, because, after all, that's part of the theme here. The second item on the list has to do with the future of Schengen. That's a more specific question, although there are many dimensions to that issue of the future of the EU in this policy area. But let's start with the first one. I think you could argue, at least from a conventional political science perspective, that issues of state sovereignty, border control, that has all been within the same package of statehood, the sovereign state, the modern state, and so on. And in that perspective, one could provocatively say, are we at all surprised about states taking back, so to say, this opportunity to control their territory? While we say that, it also means that we downplay the effects of European integration. In the long run here, I think the argument would be that Europe seems to be moving in a more, let's say, conventional realpolitik direction. To refer to Robert Cooper's terminology, maybe becoming modern again rather than being postmodern. The more specific question for you in the panel is, can you help us understand why these border controls are reintroduced? We have heard a number of different explanations here, and it would be interesting to hear some reflections on your takes on that. We have had references to the changing European security environment in the morning. Here have been other political and perceptual explanations and so on. Is there anyone who would like to set the agenda here by commenting on this question? Why do we see this?
Well, you mentioned it, and it's a core function of the state to provide security. It's the core idea of the functionalist approach to European integration is also that states only give up security if they can see, or give up sovereignty because they can see an advantage, or because they're pressured to do it. Because and this is when we look at the different steps, and when we look at Schengen and we look at the common market, this has been because the European member states of the EU could see, or EC then could see, that they had to move further in integration to be competitive on these global markets. So of course there is this reflex, and I would argue, well, it's a combined thing. It's a reflex, of course, that we go to that there is this fortress Europe. So we look at, and this was the joint. I think everybody kind of commented, well, we have to do something about the external borders. During these fall months of 2015, we have to do something about the external borders. We can only save Schengen if we push up like the Fortress Europe, which is happening. And then we have these governments that are pressured by right-wing populist parties in Denmark, of course, especially because they need their support. But these movements sentiments are there in all the rest, most of the rest of Europe too. So they, on the one side, then of course they know that there's a strong interest in open borders, that we need open borders, that it's actually would be very expensive to go back to the pre-Schengen era, and have a full control of every national borders in Europe, and would ruin the economy. So we have these border control light, which is applied everywhere on these borders, very specific spots only, and it's not very effective, as we've heard. But it's apparently enough to satisfy this vague feeling of insecurity that people have, which they put on refugees and migration. But if you look more in depth of it, if you see the protests in France, the Gilets jaunes, it is an insecurity about life and globalization, about all these threats of climate change and so on that come about uneven development in Europe and within the European countries, which I think is a real challenge. And the refugees are just an image that mirror it.
Okay. Katarina?
Well, yeah, I think it's the reply to your question is that it's simply a misunderstood attempt to please public opinion. I think the word simply is too alluring today, where control is part of the zeitgeist in Europe. We heard from Brexit that the winning argument was take back control. The border control does not give anyone control over the border. But that's what I think is the association being made in the public mind. And I think there's a false dichotomy between Schengen as a borderless zone, no control, and then control that we can get through these border controls. In essence, we're just telling criminals where the police will be. It's not the police themselves, if they would dare talk and not be afraid of having their allowances cut back even more than they are under pressure today. I don't think you would find many who would say this is effective at all. So, and actually, I think if a lot is being done as compensatory measures for the Schengen, the Schengen information system, the databases that come with that, the possibilities, as I mentioned from the Dutch example, of spot checks in a zone around the country, there is not necessarily any inherent choice between having control and then having and security that everybody wants, and then having Schengen, but it's being made into this choice that we have to make, and the debate is being extremely polarized because it's seen as a choice between these two issues. And in that case, I would choose control. I mean, who wouldn't? I mean, I can bring my passport. Sure, it's annoying, but it's not that bad. But there is no such choice between, because the checks that we have at the border today are simply not giving us control over the borders. You would need a return to DDR situations before you would get border control in the essence of the word.
So symbolic rather than effective, if that's the yes.
Well, if you ask why did this happen, I don't have a good answer to that. But sometimes when I think about what has happened in Europe and the Western world and United States in the last 5 years, and how much this has benefited right-wing populism, I think of this as a kind of perfect storm. And it's really unfortunate when you look back on this and how different events, different things that have happened have fit into each other. Migration, the crisis, the war in Syria, and many other things that happened at the same time led to a difficult situation in Europe, and how this was used by, well, right-wing parties, authoritarian parties. If you look at another explanation, if you look at mistakes that the European Union have made, I have said other times, and I still think the European Union should have acted quickly against Hungary. I think Hungary is, in a way, the key country here. So instead of understanding the dangers of the authoritarian policy conducted by the Fidesz party and Viktor Orban, European Union didn't do anything, and instead now is reacting against Poland, which is not quite exactly the same thing. And that is, in a way, a mistake, I think, not to understand the dangers of letting a member state develop real authoritarian policies. And if you go even further back and look at legal criteria, you have the so-called Copenhagen criteria from 1993 on new member states and what they are going to do, rules that they have to live up to, which were fine. The member states who joined in 2004 live up to those criteria, but then you didn't have any mechanism on how to supervise them and what would happen afterwards. And I think many of those reasons have cooperated or combined into creating this unpleasant situation today.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, please.
Basically, on the point that I made before about the lack of mutual trust, I think that this is one of the key problems that are underpinning the Schengen area. There is integration in so many respects, but also in some other respects there are specific national policies. Therefore, there is no integration as to how border control are to be performed. These remain within the authority of the member states, and there you see significant divergences as to which ministries are responsible for that, what type of mechanisms are being deployed at the national level. This also has to do with the resources that each member state has, and their financial divergences between member states also show that may means that they have different means in controlling their borders. I think that there is this lack of trust means also that they have a lack of understanding of how other national authorities operate, and at the same time they have an understanding that movement inherently as an activity is dangerous, coming either between EU nationals and or of asylum seekers secondarily move within the EU.
Thank you. Marcus?
Yeah, I'm thinking of this question, why these border controls have been introduced. Maybe I would like to ask instead how these border controls have come into action. And I'm thinking of the Öresund Bridge, which was built in the 1990s, and it was supposed to be this kind of free flow traffic across the Öresund Strait, and what an irony it is really today, because in 2015 it became the bridge became really part of this border control system. So in a way, and this was not really foreseen, I think, when the bridge was built, and we had these visions about the integrated Öresund region. So in a way, to also put the question, how is this happening, and to follow it also on you can say a citizen level, not just state level, but also what happens in the local settings, and how do people deal with this in local situations? Sorry.
Thank you very much. Donna, do you have anything here you would like to add?
Thank you very much. I would very much like to add to the discussion. I agree with most of your comments. In my opinion, I would say that the strengthening of border controls, and actually in the example of the Western Balkan states with sending military to the border, this is a phenomenon or a reflection of all the thoughts you shared here. But mostly in this case, these are small states which are very recently independent. This is the first cause of acting or conducting this kind of policy. Then the second thing is definitely the lack of trust. If you don't share the trust at the EU level, then how can you share the trust within the region with the history of atrocity 10 or 15 years ago? Yeah. And then the third thing is definitely a securitization of the migration issue. Then the migration issue became an urgent policy, and then you react to this urgent policy with extraordinary measures. You are trying to protect your sovereignty. I'm coming here from the Western Balkans perspective. So you are reacting to the migration issue by sending military to border. And then there is the phenomenon which is much broader, and that is a lack of trust, and also trying to protect your recently gained independence. So I think this is the cause of.
Thank you for providing a lot of food for thought. I'm sure that we'll return to these issues in the question session. But I will take the opportunity to shift the focus a little bit now to the future, which is always interesting. Of course, and in this case, the future of the Schengen regime, I will call it, but the arrangement, so to say. There is an issue of how threatening to Schengen is the developments that we have discussed in the morning. In addition to that, are there specific issues, problems, with a weakening or even collapsing Schengen, specific problems for small states? And I think there are political and legal aspects to this. A very specific question is what happens when the 3-year period runs out here. Will the legal logic stand down to some sort of overriding political logic, or how strong is the European legal arrangement in that sense? Who would like to start?
Well, let me just say that I think it will be very interesting to see what will happen now. I think it's in February when the current Swedish... May.
It was just renewed this November, 12th of November.
Yeah, okay.
The new period started half a year.
Okay, let's count on that then. But then Sweden would already exceed actually the 3-year period within that. Okay, but let's assume that. And you can't just prolong this, of course. So then I would I would prefer, in a way, the Dutch model that you talked about, because that is something you can do within the system, which would be and could even perhaps be more efficient. So I don't know why Sweden hasn't opted for that, but may do so in the future. But I think the Commission has a key role here. The Commission must somehow enforce the Schengen rules and also initiate infringement proceedings against member states who fail to respect them. It's actually, there may be states who may be tempted to somehow violate them. I think we will see that, but this is for the Commission and the Court of Justice to somehow try to protect and supervise.
So in your perspective, this is a sort of standard issue?
Well, it's not a standard issue because we haven't seen it at this scale before that we can perhaps anticipate now will come. But it's from the legal point of view, it's something that can be handled within the legal framework. Yes.
What about others in the panel here? Are you all in agreement, or?
Well, I'm not sure what this 3-year period is, because as I understand, the rules are already being bent to the very maximum. And from the Danish government side, what they expect is that as long as they want, they can renew the border controls, because they claim that they are within the Schengen rules, and the Schengen rules are being revised. I think it was mentioned earlier that the Schengen border code is now under negotiation. Those rules, and I think you introduced them, they will allow again that controls can be put in place for 1 year, then renewed half a year. And in the Danish government's interpretation of this new Schengen border code, it will allow border controls like the Danish ones now to be prolonged as long as there's a national interest in it. Other countries mean differently, and the Commission and other member states, and especially in Southern Europe, are very keen to test this as the European Court of Justice. So coming back to the future of Schengen, this could lead to a treaty infringement case against a country with border control. Denmark has a special arrangement because of our opt-out, so we might be ruled to be in breach of Schengen rules, which could mean Denmark would have to leave Schengen. The consequences of that would have, there would be no, not even the most positive view of how the security benefits from border control could ever accommodate the loss of security that an exit from Schengen would give Denmark, with access to all the databases. Danish Europol membership, also because of our special situation, would also be stopped. So that would be, very bad security situation for Denmark. And I think there is the end of Schengen was discussed in the height of the migration crisis, but there is no real. I think I've heard nobody who would believe that the Benelux countries and Germany and France and maybe 1 or 2 others would ever want to have a situation without Schengen. So what we would end up with would not be end of Schengen, it would be mini Schengens. And I think Macron and others are very keen to actually find a way to divide, to move forward in a core of European countries. So the test that our small countries are putting on Schengen might actually lead to a Europe of more multiple speeds, which could have, which I think is not in the Danish interest, at least not in the government interest, and not in the Swedish one either. So we're really setting in motion some movements that I think have much broader controls and potentially very negative effects on small countries.
Okay.
Yeah, I totally second what all that you have said. Basically, if one sees the proposal of the Commission, there is, apart from the reintroduction of border control, there is also emphasis on the procedural requirements on how to do so. And these are stricter for its renewal. And that's what I mentioned with risk assessments that the member states should have to provide, and these need to be then approved. Therefore, also the Commission mentions that there need to consider alternative mechanisms apart from the introduction of border control, and this is through the use of modern technologies and the use of certain police checks. So there are certain alternatives which are being proposed. Again, we don't have a final agreement on that, so we don't know how this is going to be negotiated or what will be the outcome. Therefore, I think that that the future of Schengen, to one extent, will be determined by how these negotiations are going to be forwarded in the future. But at the same time, I also agree that persistent violations of the Schengen rules may lead to a case before the Court of Justice, and then we may face what you mentioned about the creation of mini Schengen zones, whereby certain member states, which are probably the oldest ones or will share certain characteristics, will have to formulate coalitions and develop even more rules on integrations. This is something that has been done in the past, and then progressively try to implement that to other member states in the future who are compliant with these rules on the basis of whether they want, whether they can. I think this could be the solution.
Okay. Marcus?
Yeah. Maybe I don't have so much to say about the political development when it comes to the future of Schengen, and the future of the border controls. But I think people in this border area, they live with the border control, and they have adapted to the border control today. So this is also a question about ourselves, how we deal with this border control. And what one could see when the border control was introduced in 2015 was that, for example, Swedish people living on the Swedish side of the Öresund region who had worked in Copenhagen before, they stopped working there, and they found new jobs on their own side of the border. But that development, I think, stops. So today people have, in a way, adjusted to this border control, and I think that is can be a representation of how people actually look at these border controls as something which affect their future, so to say.
Okay. Martin and Dana, do you have anything?
I think I agree with everything that has been said. So.
Okay. That was quick.
Well, we have this funny situation. If you talk, when we go back to people in the border regions, I mean, we have, of course, in the border regions many people who are appalled by the controls. On the other hand, we have the Danish People's Party scoring their best results in the two municipalities on the Danish-German border, and their really best result in the town right on the Danish-German border, Padborg. Last European and national elections, we have the Sverigedemokraterna having very good results in Skåne. So I think we also have to realize that that this idea we support as the border region, an open border region, a cross-border region, being a region full of opportunities and possibilities and something very good, is not shared by everybody. Which leads back to this, what I'm mentioning, that I think sometimes we are really, when we look at migration issues and border controls, we are not really discussing the core issue, which is uneven development. It's a central peripherality issue, where, funny enough, the idea of open borders was supposed to end this center peripherality, like by creating a cross-border region, you should come out of the peripherality, but it hasn't really worked, apparently.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, please, Dana.
I would like to stress this phenomenon of open borders. If you take a look at the countries from Central and Eastern Europe, the main goal of their association and entering the European Union was to entering the Europe without the borders. We are fed up with the borders. So now you have the completely opposite phenomenon. With the migration crisis, the entire Schengen system is now in question, and also the system of open borders. So we are strengthening our border controls, we are strengthening borders, and the other thing is this multi-level or multi-layer Europe, where there are so many solutions and with creating so many mini Schengens or any other solutions in different policy areas. This is not actually the European Union small states from the region of Central Eastern Europe were striving for, but some of them actually caused it, like Hungary. So this is quite controversial, issue.
Thank you. Interesting point there. Now let's open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. Let's start with, should we say, 2 questions, and then we'll see who in the panel would like to respond to that. I see a hand here, right in front of me, and on the same. Okay, well, it was hijacked, but yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Amila Aljanovic, and I would like to thank you all for your presentation and your different perspectives of this topic. Well, I am a Bosnian citizen as well as I am a Swedish citizen, and I travel to Bosnia and Croatia a couple of times a year to visit my relatives. So I have faced this refugee crisis at Balkan these latest years. And I come from a small city in the northern of Bosnia called Bihać, which is close to the Croatian border. So the city of Bihać has now received a great amount of refugees from other Balkan countries who wants to now cross the border to get to Croatia and Slovenia and other European countries. And I was in Bosnia a couple of weeks ago, and I faced a big demonstration from the citizens of Bihać who doesn't want these refugees in their city and not in their countries. And the fact is actually that the city of Bihać does not have a refugee camp, so they have improvised one, who is actually across the street where I live. So my question would be to Jana Lusha. What is Bosnia and Herzegovina's role as a non-EU member, and what do you think must be done both on national level in the Balkan countries and international level, for instance in the EU, to facilitate for the Balkan countries, especially these non-EU members? Thank you.
Thank you. And before we let you answer that, I'll also ask the rest of the panel if you would like to add to that issue. But let's take a second question. Right.
I was not prepared for that, but I'll try to ask this anyway. I'd like to. Oh, my name is Robin. It's not really pertinent to the question, but and I also don't have a particular story to tell. But I'd like to ask you about an overarching question about the European Union as a whole. Is the precedent set by the European states' handling of the refugee crisis dangerous? I believe it is to some extent. And is it properly equipped to deal with oncoming possible migration crises? Because this will not be the last crisis in the history of the European Union, unless we are perishing in a nuclear war tomorrow, which you don't know. But, is the precedent dangerous, and will it hamper potential future crises, such as climate migration, because that is something that will possibly happen according to the United Nations. And if this is a danger to the European Union as a whole, and if further steps need to be taken to enforce migration policy unity, or something in a similar vein to that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we start in the more specific issue here on cross-border regions and how to deal with the internal, external dynamics there. Would you like to start, Anna?
Yeah. Thank you very much for your question. Yes, the situation in Bihać quite reflects the problem of the entire European migration crisis. The first issue you asked about the demonstrations. This was actually very much present in every single Western Balkan state through which migration route was going through. So basically, local population, when faced with migrants going through streets, develops different kinds of attitudes toward those migrants, which results with different stereotypes and different xenophobia feelings, or even Islamophobia in some parts of the Western Balkan region. In this case, actually, those migrants, as you said, do not have migrants of refugee camps. They are wandering around the streets, and local population are quite afraid of the challenging which that brings with it. The problem is how to resolve the issue of those people which are stuck there. But we had the same situation during 2015 and 2016 where some EU member states closed their border. So you had refugees being stuck in Croatia for some time or in Serbia for some time. Now we have the situation with Bosnia. These refugees are trying to, cross the border somehow, and there are so many incidents on a daily basis on the border, where also Croatia is illustrated as a country which does not have any kinds of feeling towards human rights, and it's not showing any human dimension on crisis. But as the EU member states, you actually need to obey the EU rules, and you need to set some rules at the borders. So how to resolve the crisis? This is a very complicated issue which is being resolved for months now, and I don't see any kinds of solution coming in the near future. Those migrants were registered in other countries. I think they came to Greece, as I follow the issue, so they were registered in Greece. Whether Bosnia should send them back, but Greece would not accept them. So currently they are stuck there, and the society of Bihać needs to bear the consequences of the situation. Bosnia is not the EU member state. It received some funds to build some refugee camps and centers. There are some inclinations whether these funds were used properly. So this is very complicated issue. I don't know what to answer to you. Actually, if I knew the answer, I would probably not be here, or I would be some leading politician in the region resolving the crisis. But I really don't know how to resolve the issue, but very specific issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that answer. Anyone else in the panel on this issue? It, of course, relates to the second question in a sense. So unless you have specific comments here, we could expand it to this larger issue of both how equipped the EU is, or what the recent years show us in terms of how potent the EU as an organization is to deal with this, but also what the implication, I think, of this is.
Yeah, just a reflection on that. I'm thinking that speaking about this European identity, that we have very different experiences depending on where in Europe we live or where we are. And we have transit areas, and we have reception areas, and we have also interaction between different areas and in different ways. So it's really complex in that sense. Yeah.
Yes, please.
On that point, what you mentioned is very, very much true. We see that in the past few years there have been what is perceived like a financial crisis, a humanitarian crisis, a refugee crisis, security crisis, and basically I'm a little bit allergic to the term crisis. I'm a lawyer. I don't know much about how crisis is from a political science perspective, but a crisis as a notion, coming from a Greek word actually, means that it basically legitimizes certain solutions that are otherwise discarded or otherwise would have been more negotiated and scrutinized more. So I'm a little bit allergic to this term in principle, but I agree that I think that the underlying rationale behind all these perceived crises is more of a political crisis of the European Union. And I think that this political crisis may or may not come to to an end. Bear in mind, first of all, that we're living in an era where Brexit is around the corner. We're living in an era where next year we're having European Parliament elections. A new Commission is going to be created. Therefore, we are in a crossroads of how the EU may develop in the future. I see a European Union which is a little bit tired in providing inspiring solutions, and it goes to the default position of maximizing control rather than enhancing protection. But I want to be optimistic, and I want to think that maybe in the future there will be some opportunity to actually change that. So there are a lot of things to await in that respect.
Interesting times. Yep.
If I may add on this, I'm not that optimistic as you are, but because I think I think what we can see is actually that the EU is developing a migration policy, but it's a policy of non-migration. And what I would also not talk about crisis, because I think if you look at this from this realist perspective and from this idea of taking back control of the external frontiers, taking control of the migration movements, keeping them out of Europe, keeping them in North Africa, the EU is actually quite successful at the moment, because they can, I think the Libyan example is where you have a country that is a total failed state and nobody knows who controls it, but still the EU is managing to keep the refugees there and probably sending them back. I mean, they equipped the Libyan Coast Guard, which probably some paramilitary out of anybody's control, but they can get the Libyan Coast Guard to stop the refugees. So this is a very and when you mention the future crisis which will come, I would even sarcastically say yes, the EU is prepared, because they're doing everything to create structures that the migrants will stay outside of Europe. That will come. And I don't really see that there will be a transformation to a constructive migration policy, getting people into the EU in the near future. This will be up to the member states, perhaps, that some member states say, we have a demand and we let some engineers come in and we let we need some people who clear the trash, so we let some Africans come in, but it will not be a all European saying, well, this is our responsibility, climate change and so on, and we have to take like 1 million migrants or 5 million migrants every year.
If I may reply on that point, to a large extent, I agree with what you say. My optimism stems from the fact that there have been certain initiatives, especially at the European Parliament level, to show some understanding of the issues as regards migration. Only recently, for instance, the European Parliament is trying to pass a resolution on humanitarian visas, for instance. I am aware of the fact that in the end there were problems with the voting within the European Parliament, but I think that there is still some shred of optimism in the cracks of the European Union, in that there are still certain initiatives that are being promoted, and the more that we discuss about them, the more visible we make them, and the more optimistic we are, we may change a little bit the narrative. Because I have been very much of a pessimist in the past years, and it didn't lead me anywhere. So I'm changing the narrative. Maybe this can bring a result.
Okay, Katarina, please.
Well, I think the answer to your question also is there's an X factor here, that's time until the next crisis. Because I think, sharing your view on crisis, at the moment there is no, right now there is zero chance of the EU suddenly developing radical new lines on migration policy. For instance, the Dublin regulation that was mentioned a couple of times, it was proposed, the review of it was proposed in 2016. There is still no chance of finding a compromise. You have countries like Poland and Slovakia and Hungary completely blocking any chance of it being agreed in its current shape. But the traces of the 2015 crisis are still very visible and you showed some graphs also how high migration is up on the public mindset. The numbers of migrants coming into Europe is the lowest in 9 years. If that continues, I think it will drift off the public radar in a couple of years. Not it disappear, but other issues might climb up, and then might be the time to suddenly introduce new legislation in the EU that could make the EU prepared to handle a future crisis. I've heard, when you ask people in Brussels what will happen to the Dublin regulation now, there's a feeling that it could lead to another QMV vote. Now some presidents in the future will say, we have to move forward, let's see, and then there might be some court cases, but again, they might test it that way. Or again, we have a Europe of multiple speeds where some countries will move ahead in certain groups, but then I think there will be more consequences also for outsiders, maybe in terms of funding or some other issues that will somehow be dreamt up as a package. But those two options of either forcing it through and dealing with the court cases or a multiple speed Europe, I think are also to be kept in mind.
Thank you for that. Let's take 2 short questions. I see a hand here, and I don't know who was first. Yes, at the back there.
Thank you very much for this very interesting seminar. My general feeling is that the thing with border control is not so effective as it might seem, and that it's maybe been used rather for a political purpose to make a symbolic to make people feel safe rather than actually having an effective use. So my question would be, is there any alternative for this matter to make people feel safe, to make people feel, instead of making these border controls, but still having the issue of safety?
Okay, thank you. And then, I don't know if we have, we have a microphone there.
Thank you. I've already introduced myself. I'm Christina. I'm at the European Studies Center. My question is, I would like to change the perspective from the European to Europe as a global actor, EU as a global actor, and see if this internal disagreement or lack of agreement or lack of failure in cooperation would both affect the European Union as a credible actor for human rights, liberal trade, cooperation promoter, and so on, which we are so proud of on one hand, and on the other hand, for those that are not in favor of the European Union, would even work against the individual states that are actually smaller states that are very much promoter of the human rights and liberal trade and so on. So it's like a negative, both as if we don't agree internally, we will not be able to actually stand for what we want to stand for, neither as a single state nor as a union. So wouldn't that be a help to agree to find the solution?
Okay, thank you. Let's start with the first question here. Alternatives for perceptions of security. Anyone with thoughts on that?
Just very spontaneously, I think it's really an important question, and I think, the concept of integration is of course important, that societies are integrated and all people in a way take part in society, and that you have meeting grounds where you can actually meet people from different backgrounds, and I think that is a problem today, that we are very much this integration doesn't really exist in Sweden and Denmark and elsewhere. So and this question about safety and security is of course also something which is quite subjective in many ways. So I would start there in that, and then of course it's very difficult but to work on different integration issues on different social and spatial levels for citizens and for people in general. and of course also the European level is quite important in that way. But it's difficult, I think.
I think safety, I mean, this is now I'm getting totally out of my field, but safety is sociology. It's about community.
Yeah.
I mean, humans need community to feel safe. And this can be the family, or it used to be the family. It still is the family in countries like Afghanistan, where states are not able to provide security, then it's the family. It used to be religion, the church congregation. It became the state. Well, we can argue it was the state since medieval times. It was a landlord that protected his serfs against robbers or other enemies. Then it became religion. Increasingly, it became the church, where you kind of felt safe by believing in that God would save you, or if you prayed, and it became the nation state and the welfare state. We have had an agenda of global capitalism. We have these reforms. We have insecurity caused by developments which apparently are outside the control of the state. And suddenly we have all these threats and the lack of security. And I think this is why people fear or have this fear of crime or some such that could happen, even though it's not that realistic, at least not here in Sweden or in Denmark or in Germany or in France or like in the developed countries of Europe. I would say, I don't know if there's a perfect answer or not. It's a little bit about creating a narrative, an agenda again, that actually the state is protecting you, but protecting you as from threats of globalization and of course very concrete also from crime. And at the same time creating local communities that are strong. I think when we look into this, what people fear, or people who fear, it is usually people who fear migrants, or this idea, because it's an abstract mass of people, but it's not concrete people they know. And you can, for Germany, there are pretty explicit studies where they can demonstrate a correlation between people who have daily contacts with people from other cultural backgrounds, and usually they don't fear them. They don't see it's a problem at all. They might see that there are specific issues with some people, but not as a generalization, where people who are well, we discussed this yesterday, whether xenophobic is a good term or not. Ida will talk more about this in the afternoon. But people who tend to have this what we consider xenophobic attitudes often are people from communities which have been disturbed by economic developments, peripheral, and which usually are not in a daily contact with people from other communities.
Mm-hmm. Short, please, from both of you.
Oh, do you want to go first? Oh.
No, just go first.
Well, from my understanding, the notions of safety and security are a little bit different. Like, safety is more about physical safety. It requires more micromanagement at the national level, whereby security, in my understanding, is more of a collective value, that it is the one that is to be protected both at EU level and at national level, whereas safety is more about national level, at least to my understanding. As regards the alternatives to border control, we have to differentiate from which perspective we want to view the problem. If we want to view it, I will consider it from a law enforcement perspective. If our quest is to have zero terrorist threats, I think for me, the more emphasis should be placed on how member states' authorities should cooperate on the basis of existing tools and mechanisms that they have on exchanging data, feeding data on potentially suspected individuals in their systems, and exchange them with other member states. I think for me, from my understanding, this is the best solution. From a migration perspective, I think I don't know much about that. I would say that I would agree with your point about integration and fostering an environment where refugees are welcome, but I think that this is more of a chimera as an idea rather than a viable solution. So I don't have more perspectives to add on that. I'm really sorry.
Okay. Just a short comment of fear. Yeah, fear is actually a feeling which is being constructed, and everything what we face in international relation is some kind of product of our interactions and constructions. So if you go to a football game and you become violent, you know, it is a product of your environment and the interaction at the stadium, you know. So maybe you would not act like that, but if everyone else at the stands acts like that, maybe you will also construct this kind of behavior. So there are certain data behind the construction of fear in Europe. These are the rise of terrorist attacks, the rise of crime rates, and so on. But there are also there is also this feeling of fear in countries which haven't even experienced the terrorist attacks or raising criminal rates. So I would say that Europe can work in terms of constructing these feelings which are spreading all around the member states, because when something happens in one member state, it's spread through media to public discourse, and the fear is being constructed in every other member state who even did not experience these kinds of events. So this is like also a product of construction and of public discourse in other EU member states.
Thank you. Finally, then, the question of external implications, or implications for external action, perhaps. Is that anything that the panel has thought about?
Well, I think you made a very important point, that the EU is experiencing a transformation of values and ideas, and that the EU is realizing that they are actually a geopolitical hard power, and not just a soft power. And when we take the small states, I'm amazed about the Danish discourse, which is now totally moving away from multilateralism, from the FN, United Nations approach to human rights and so on, where you even have social democrats who say that we have to get out of these conventions. So this is definitely happening. And we should also keep in mind, I do not believe that the EU as an organization is actually threatened by the right-wing populists, because what they're doing now is trying to change it with what they want. Marine Le Pen will not leave the EU. Sebastian Kurz is very active in Austria in moving the EU into this more national right-wing populist direction. I don't think the Danish People's Party will ever actually leave the EU, because this is one of the things that Brexit is all teaching us, because they can see the consequences it has. So what I think, and definitely people like Kaczynski and Orban don't want to leave the EU. So we have a movement that wants to change the EU.
Thank you. Who else on this point? Anyone? Yes.
Just a very small comment. Like countries like Hungary, I don't think that they care that much about whether the EU is going to be a valuable or important global actor. I think what we've seen from these policies is that member states have become all the more selfish and care only about their own interests rather than about the collective EU interest. Therefore, I think that while what you say is a very important point, and as a European scholar, I fully agree with that, I don't think that for member states that would be something to think about that much.
Okay.
That they would care about. Yeah.
Any final remarks? No? Then before I leave the floor to you, Maria, let me thank all of you in the panel for a very interesting both presentations earlier and also comments now, and thanks also to the audience for good questions. Let's give a hand. Yeah.
Thank you so much, all, and that already emptied out one of my 2 points that I had left, because I think that we can all agree that we have had an incredibly interesting morning here, and you have all really contributed to both very thought-provoking and stimulating discussions that I hope will continue, not only between us who work in academia, but also those of you who write student papers, who write bachelor's thesis, who write master's thesis, and so on. I think this might be one of the ideas of really important topics that I hope we might have stimulated some of you to dig further into. So I had, in addition to this, only two thank yous to hand out. And the first is a big collective thank you that goes to the whole panel, including Rickard also, for coming here this morning. And we have a little tiny gift each for you. So with that, we would like to again say thank you so much to you. And after we have distributed these gifts, I only have one more point to say, and that is to say that a conference like this doesn't organize itself. It takes a lot of work. It takes an incredible amount of work, much more than you would ever think. And we have had 4 people here who have made this possible. They have worked relentlessly for months on making this possible. So I would also like to say, and like for all of you to give a big applaud to our 4 helpers here, which has been Jana Range, who stands over here. And then we have Agnes Wiberg, who is a research assistant at the Center for European Studies. And then we have Maria Riksten, who is a Master of European Affairs student here at Lund University. And then we have Anna Sander, who is the intern at the moment at the Center for European Studies, and who is otherwise from the European Studies program at Lund University. So with that, thank you all, and now I think for most of us, in various ways, it's time for lunch. Thank you.